Across the world and across the ages, we've pieced together humanity's story from fragments, ruins, relics, written records, and oral traditions. Much of it makes sense. The timelines line up, the artifacts match the accounts, and the puzzle fits neatly together. But scattered through history are pieces that don't quite click. Mysteries built on hard evidence that still defy complete explanation. These aren't just myths or legends repeated around a campfire. They're real cases with physical remains, detailed accounts, or tangible artifacts that resist easy answers. Burials with origins that don't match their location. Maps that seem to show lands no one was supposed to have reached. Objects crafted with skills far ahead of their time. Disappearances, events, and records that leave us with more questions than facts. In this journey, we'll travel across continents and through centuries, from prehistory to the early 20th century, exploring 20 such mysteries. Each one comes with its own set of clues, its own historical context, and at least one detail so unusual it has kept historians, archaeologists, and researchers debating for decades. We'll look at the who, what, and where of each case. We'll place them in the broader history of their time, highlight the details that set them apart, and trace the unanswered questions that have kept them alive in the public imagination. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. So whether you're watching closely or just listening in, settle in and let the outside world fade for a while. Our first stop takes us to the deserts of Western China, where the sands preserve some of the best-kept ancient remains ever found, with faces no one expected to see there. The Tarim Basin in China's Xinjiang region is one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. A vast depression ringed by mountains and dominated by the Taklamakan Desert, it's a landscape of scorching summers, freezing winters, and winds that whip the sand into blinding storms. For most of history, it's been a place people pass through, not a place to settle. Yet buried beneath its dunes lay a secret that would astonish archaeologists and challenge long-held ideas about the movement of ancient peoples. The first hint came in the 1930s, when Chinese and Western teams exploring remote burial sites began unearthing human remains that seemed to have been frozen in time. The dry, alkaline sands had preserved not just bones, but skin, hair, and clothing, as if the dead had simply lain down to sleep thousands of years ago. At a glance, it was clear these individuals didn't match the image of ancient populations in Western China. Many were tall, with long noses, deep-set eyes, and light brown or reddish hair that still clung to their scalps. In some cases, braids and individual strands were perfectly intact. Work in the region halted for decades, but when Chinese archaeologists returned in the 1970s and 1980s with improved excavation methods, the picture became even stranger. Dozens of mummies emerged from the sand, each buried with care, each dressed in garments that spoke of an advanced textile tradition. There were long-sleeved robes made from wool woven in twill and plaid patterns, the kind of designs archaeologists usually associate with Bronze Age Europe. There were cloaks, trousers, leather boots lined with fur, and felt caps. The tailoring was precise, seams reinforced, the fabrics dyed in warm earth tones. These were not rough frontier clothes, they were expertly made for both practicality and style. One of the most famous burials, known as the Beauty of Lulan, dates to around 1800 BC. She lies in her grave with her hair, fine, light brown and braided, fanned around her head. Her eyelashes are still visible, her expression serene. She wears a warm woolen cloak, a felt hat, and soft leather boots. In her coffin are simple but telling items: a woven basket, a wooden comb, and a small amount of grain, likely an offering for the afterlife. Across other burial sites, archaeologists found baskets made of reeds, wooden bowls, and food that had been placed alongside the dead. Wheat and millet were common, a combination that's striking because wheat originated in the Near East, while millet was domesticated in East Asia. The presence of both in one community suggests a meeting point of cultures and possibly trade or migration routes stretching across thousands of kilometers. Pottery fragments and dairy residues hint at a mixed lifestyle of farming and herding, and in some graves, lumps of what appeared to be ancient cheese were still intact after 3.5 millennia. How did people with such apparent Western Eurasian features, wearing clothes and weaving fabrics in styles known from Europe, end up in this remote desert? One theory links them to the Tocharians, an Indo-European-speaking people recorded in Chinese sources over 1,000 years after the Lulan beauty was buried. Linguistic evidence from much later Tocharian texts shows clear connections to languages as far away as Celtic and Germanic, a clue that their ancestors may have traveled eastward across the Eurasian steppe in prehistoric times. The Tarim Basin would later become a crucial corridor on the Silk Road, but these mummies predate that famous trade network by more than 1,000 years. This suggests that far earlier than historians once believed, there were already long-distance contacts across Eurasia, people, goods, and ideas moving between west and east in ways we're only beginning to understand. The wheat in their graves may have come from the far west, the millet from the east. Their wool-working skills suggest they either brought textile traditions with them or adopted them through close contact with other advanced cultures. Equally remarkable is how perfectly the desert preserved them. The Tarim Basin's climate, dry, cold, and alkaline, acted like a natural tomb. No elaborate embalming was needed. The environment did the work. Sandstorms quickly covered the graves, sealing them off from decay. In some cases, archaeologists lifting the lids of coffins were met with the faint smell of ancient leather or wool, as if the burial had happened only years ago. And yet, for all the physical evidence, there is no written record from these people. No inscriptions, no surviving documents to tell us their language, their beliefs, or how they saw themselves. We have their bodies, their clothes, their tools, but not their voices. Were they settlers who made this desert their home? Traders passing through and choosing, or being forced to stay? Or the remnants of a much larger migration that left few other traces? The mystery deepens when you consider how isolated they must have been. Surrounded by desert and mountains, any connection to the wider world would have been hard-won. Yet their material culture shows they were anything but cut off. Their weaving techniques, their foods, and even their burial customs suggest a blending of influences from far-flung places. The Tarim Basin may have been remote, but for these people, it was not disconnected. Over the decades, more mummies have been found, some as old as 2000 BC, others dating to the 1st centuries CE. They vary in age, clothing style, and burial practice. But the overall picture remains the same, a population that does not fit neatly into the conventional narrative of ancient China. Modern DNA studies have confirmed what the eyes already suspected. These people had genetic links to Western Eurasian populations, and yet their story in this part of the world is still largely untold. Standing in the desert, looking at a face that has lain there for nearly 4,000 years, you can't help but wonder what they saw in this land of sand and wind. Was it a place of opportunity, a gateway between worlds, or a last refuge at the end of a long migration? Without their words, we may never know. But the evidence they left behind refuses to be ignored. Perhaps the most intriguing question is the simplest. How early did East and West truly meet? The Antung Mummies suggest it was far earlier than the official histories claim. If that's the case, then our picture of the ancient world, with its neat lines and separate spheres, might be far too simple. Could these desert burials be the proof of contact between distant cultures long before the Silk Road ever opened? And if so, how much more of that early story is still buried beneath the sands? Coming off the mystery of the Antung Mummies, with their silent stares across the sands of the Tarim Basin, we jump from the dry deserts of China to the lush volcanic highlands of Central America. It's here, in what is now western El Salvador, that archaeologists uncovered a scene frozen in time, not a serene burial ground or ceremonial center, but the remains of a battle unlike almost anything else known from Mesoamerica. Moving from the silent sands of the Tarim Basin, our path now takes us far south, into the verdant highlands of western El Salvador, to a place where beauty and violence have shared the same ground for over 1,000 years. The Chalchuapa archaeological zone is a mosaic of ancient ceremonial centers, pyramidal platforms, and earthworks, spread across an area that once formed a cultural crossroads between the Maya to the north and the Lenca to the east. In the middle of this region lies a story unlike most in Mesoamerican archaeology, a story of an intense battle whose traces linger in the soil, but whose memory has been erased from the written and oral record. Chalchuapa's ancient heart was a cluster of sites including Tazumal, Casablanca, and El Trapiche. This was not some isolated village. It was a thriving hub linked to trade and cultural exchange routes. As early as the pre-classic period, monumental architecture rose here, platforms faced with cut stone, plazas for ritual gatherings, and pyramid temples that would have dominated the skyline. The artistic styles and artifacts show influences from the great Olmec centers in the Gulf Coast, later blending with Maya iconography as the centuries passed. For much of its history, Chalchuapa seems to have been a ceremonial and political center, not a fortress. But around the 6th or 7th century AD, something changed. Beneath the layers of ritual deposits, archaeologists began to find unmistakable signs of conflict. In certain areas, the soil yielded dense concentrations of obsidian projectile points and chert blades, lethal tools of war in the Mesoamerican world. The points were not scattered as if lost during a hunt, but clustered in ways that suggested volleys of missiles or intense close combat. Even more telling were the human remains. Excavations revealed skeletons showing clear evidence of violent death, fractured skulls, cut marks on bones, and positions suggesting hurried burial. In one particularly haunting case, over 30 male skeletons were found together, interred during the construction of a ceremonial mound. Whether they were defeated defenders, executed captives, or something else entirely remains uncertain. But their placement suggests their deaths were entwined with the political and ritual fabric of the city. The fortifications uncovered here stand out sharply in the context of Mesoamerican archaeology. While warfare certainly existed, it was often ritualized, with conflicts between city-states serving to capture enemies for sacrifice, or settle disputes without prolonged sieges. Defensive walls, especially ones meant to withstand sustained assault, were not the norm in many lowland Maya or peripheral centers. At Chalchuapa, however, earthen and stone embankments appear to have been thrown up, some of them showing signs of rapid repair. It's the kind of work you do when you believe the enemy will be back. The most intriguing detail may lie in the obsidian itself. Chemical sourcing has shown that these artifacts were made from stone originating in multiple regions, some perhaps from highland Guatemala, others from sources in central or western El Salvador. This raises the possibility that more than two sides were involved, or that alliances brought in warriors from far afield. If the defenders were Maya-affiliated, were they facing a Lenca coalition? Or was this an internal Maya dispute that pulled in outside support? No contemporary inscriptions mention the battle. No surviving Lenca oral tradition recalls a great fight here. It is as if the event was deliberately left out of history. What could have sparked such a clash? The 6th and 7th centuries were a time of upheaval in parts of Mesoamerica. Major Maya centers like Tikal and Calakmul were locked in cycles of war, alliances, and betrayals. Trade routes shifted, and smaller centers sometimes found themselves caught between the ambitions of greater powers. Chalchuapa's location along routes linking the Maya lowlands to Pacific trade networks may have made it both wealthy and vulnerable. Salt from the coast, obsidian from the highlands, cacao, jade, all could have been flowing through here. Control of such a hub would be a tempting prize. The archaeological record provides tantalizing hints. In some areas, the fortifications seem to have been repaired in haste, stones and earth piled without the care seen in earlier construction phases. In others, there is evidence of burned structures, perhaps the result of a siege or a punitive raid. Yet, after this burst of violence, the trail goes cold. There is no layer of rebuilding that suggests a long recovery. Instead, it's as if the place simply diminished in importance. The plazas and pyramids remained, but their political weight may have shifted elsewhere. One eerie detail is the apparent expectation of renewed attack that never came. The defenders patched their walls, shored up embankments, and prepared, yet the enemy did not return. Was the first assault so decisive that the victors no longer saw a need? Or did some greater conflict draw attention away, leaving Chalchuapa to wither quietly? The mystery deepens when we consider the absence of direct commemoration. In the Maya world, rulers loved to boast of their victories, carving elaborate stelae to record battles and captives. Here, nothing. No monument declares the names of leaders, no glyphs record the fallen. This could be because Chalchuapa's political culture was different from the Maya city-states farther north. Or it could be that the victors didn't want the story told at all. Archaeologists continued to study the zone, piecing together timelines from ceramics, radiocarbon dates, and stratigraphy. Yet the exact sequence of events remains elusive. Without written records, every interpretation must be drawn from the positioning of bones, the scattering of weapons, and the layers of earth. Each find adds a piece to the puzzle, but the full picture may never emerge. Even so, the Battle of Los Naranjos, if that's what we choose to call it, stands as one of the more captivating glimpses into a side of Mesoamerican life we rarely see so starkly. It's not the grand, ritualized warfare of painted codices or stone-carved stelae. It's something messier, more desperate, a real fight for survival, waged in the shadow of sacred pyramids, remembered only in the silent testimony of fortifications and unmarked graves. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. We can stand today on the grassy mounds, look out over the valley, and imagine the chaos. The shouts of warriors, the hiss of arrows, the crash of obsidian-tipped spears against wooden shields. We can picture the survivors patching their walls under a wary sky. But we cannot name them. We cannot say who they fought or why. All we have are the bones, the stones, and the unanswerable questions they leave behind. From this silent battlefield in El Salvador, we now travel far north and thousands of years back in time to a very different kind of mystery, one buried in an oak coffin beneath the peat of Denmark, where the Bronze Age Egtved girl waits to tell her story. From the chaos of battle in El Salvador, we move to something altogether different, a scene of stillness, precision, and quiet reverence preserved in the damp earth of northern Europe. Here, in the small Danish village of Egtved, archaeologists opened an oak coffin in 1921 and came face to face with one of the most intriguing Bronze Age burials ever found. The coffin was found in a peat bog, the kind of environment famous for preserving organic material for thousands of years. Oxygen-poor, acidic, and wet, the bog creates a natural time capsule. When the oak lid was lifted, the body itself had long since decomposed, leaving only bones and fragments. But remarkably, her clothing, hair, and several personal items lay almost exactly as they had been placed some 3,400 years earlier. The young woman became known simply as the Egtved girl. She was about 16 to 18 years old at the time of her death, during the Nordic Bronze Age around 1370 BC. What struck archaeologists first was the craftsmanship of her clothing, a short-sleeved blouse of finely woven wool and a distinctive corded skirt made of multiple strands that hung just above the knee. Around her waist was a bronze belt plate, intricately decorated with spirals and geometric designs, a masterwork of metalwork for the time. She wore bronze arm rings and a small comb made of bone. At her feet, wrapped in animal skin, lay the cremated remains of a child. The details were unusual. Bronze Age burials in Scandinavia often contained elaborate goods, weapons, tools, ornaments. But here, the focus seemed to be on the quality of the clothing and the belt plate. The bronze itself was not local. The metal would have been imported from hundreds of kilometers away, a sign of far-reaching trade connections. The wool in her garments was of exceptional quality, dyed in subtle shades and woven with great skill, suggesting she came from a family of considerable status. For decades, the Egeved girl's life remained a blank slate. Then, in the 2010s, scientists carried out isotope analysis on her hair and teeth. The results completely reshaped her story. Her teeth showed she had been born far from Egtved, likely in what is now southern Germany. Her hair, which grows about a centimeter per month, preserved a chemical record of her final 23 months of life. It revealed that she had traveled repeatedly between Denmark and her homeland in southern Germany during that period. The analysis suggested at least 2 or 3 long journeys, each spanning hundreds of kilometers, and not leisurely wanderings. These were purposeful trips, moving between 2 specific regions over and over again. Her final return to Denmark occurred only weeks before her death. This level of mobility in the Bronze Age is extraordinary. It implies organized networks capable of supporting long-distance travel and the exchange of goods, ideas, or people. But why was a teenage girl making these trips? The theories are many. She may have been part of an elite marriage alliance, strengthening political or trade ties between powerful families, or tribes in different regions. She could have been a religious figure, traveling as part of ceremonial obligations or seasonal rites, moving between sacred sites. Some suggest she may have been connected to trade caravans, acting as a representative or escort in an exchange system that carried metals, amber, and textiles across Europe. The cremated child buried with her adds another layer of mystery. Was it her child, a younger sibling, or someone unrelated but ritually significant? The cremation itself is noteworthy. In Bronze Age Denmark, inhumation was more common, especially in such carefully prepared burials. The child's inclusion hints at a personal or symbolic connection that was important enough to mark in death. There is also the question of her death itself. No signs of trauma were found on the surviving remains. There are no obvious markers of disease. It's possible she died from an illness that left no trace in bone, or perhaps from complications of travel. The timing of her final journey, ending just before her death, raises the possibility that her travels and her fate were linked. Archaeologists have noted that the Egtved girl's burial shows both local and foreign elements. The oak coffin and bog setting are consistent with high-status Nordic Bronze Age burials, but her clothing style and the origin of her belts metal point south, toward the tumulus culture of Central Europe. This blend suggests she may have embodied a connection between these 2 regions, a living link between distant peoples. The precision of her burial is striking. Her skirt was arranged neatly, her belt plate centered, her hair in place. This was not a hurried interment. Whoever buried her took care to present her as if in life, youthful, adorned, and significant. And yet, the grave goods are sparse. There are no weapons, no additional ornaments beyond the essentials. Perhaps the absence was intentional, marking her identity not through quantity of goods, but through the distinctiveness of her attire and the symbolic power of the bronze plate. Today, the Egtved girl is displayed in the National Museum of Denmark, her clothing, belt, and hair preserved in climate-controlled cases. Visitors are often surprised at how modern her skirt appears, with its layered cords swaying freely. Her belt plate remains one of the most intricate Bronze Age artifacts found in Northern Europe. But beyond the craftsmanship, the most compelling thing about her is the unanswered questions her grave poses. We know where she came from. We know she traveled immense distances at a time when most people rarely left their home region. We know she returned to Denmark shortly before her death, and that someone cared enough to give her a burial of dignity and precision. What we don't know, and may never know, is why she lived this way. Was she a figure of political importance, moving as part of a network that kept peace and trade flowing between regions? Was she a spiritual traveler, part of a cycle of ritual journeys that connected far-flung communities? Or was her mobility tied to something more personal? Family, love, obligation, now lost to time. The evidence leaves no clear answer, only the outline of an extraordinary life cut short. A young woman whose footsteps traced a route across Bronze Age Europe, now lying still in the quiet earth of a Danish bog. Leaving the quiet peatlands of Denmark behind, we cross into dry country. Basalt plateaus, dusted steppe, and long horizons where the wind has been erasing footprints for thousands of years. From the ground you might walk past them without a second glance, low, broken lines of stone, knee-high at best. But climb a ridge, or better yet, look from the air, and they resolve into vast geometric funnels. 2 or more walls sweep inward for hundreds of meters, even kilometers, narrowing to a head made of pens or a cliff edge. Early pilots thought they looked like children's toys laid across the desert and dubbed them desert kites. The name stuck. These kites spread across a broad belt of the Middle East, eastern Jordan's black basalt Hera, the steppe west of Palmyra in Syria, the lava fields and oases of northern Arabia, notably around Khaybar and Al-Ula, out into the Sinai and Negev, with cousins or close analogs reported further afield in parts of Armenia and the Caucasus. Aerial surveys and satellite imagery have mapped thousands of them. Some regions are dense with overlapping examples, old lines cut by newer ones, heads rebuilt, driving walls extended, evidence not of a single project, but of a tradition revisited and modified over centuries. Pinning down their ages is tricky. Many kites are pure stonework with no preserved wood or bone in the walls themselves. Where dating is possible, it tends to come from associated finds, hearths and camps abutting the heads, scatters of chipped stone along the driving lines, or animal bone deposits inside the pens. In a handful of sites, optically stimulated luminescence OSL on sediments and radiocarbon on nearby organic material push some examples deep into prehistory, into the late Neolithic, while others appear to have remained in use or been refurbished into the Bronze Age and even later. In short, it wasn't a single cultural moment. The kite concept seems to have had a long life. The dominant explanation is straightforward and compelling: mass hunting. Imagine a wide, shallow V opening onto steppe, or wadi, what researchers call driving lines. On a chosen day, dozens or hundreds of people spread out across the plain, forming a human net. Shouting, waving, and advancing, they drive a moving front of gazelle, onager, or oryx toward the widening mouth. The panicked herd enters the funnel. The walls squeeze their options as people close in behind. At the tip, animals are trapped in a lattice of small cells, stone pens inside the head, or are pushed over a natural drop where a cliff or steep ravine finishes the job. In some heads, narrow cells interlock like honeycomb, efficient for separating and dispatching animals. There's good support for this. Rock art panels in and around kite landscapes depict lines of animals being driven by stick figures toward enclosures. In a few heads, archaeologists have documented concentrated piles of gazelle bones, more than a family camp would need, consistent with mass kills. Along driving walls, repeated foot traffic, chipped stone debris, and occasional hearths hint at staging points and coordination hubs. The low height of walls is not necessarily a problem. In practice, even a knee-high stone line can steer herd behavior when paired with brush fencing or people stationed along it. Ethnographic parallels show similar drives using minimal barriers when the human line and terrain do the real work. But several things complicate the picture and keep the mystery alive. First, the sheer scale. Some kites run for miles, even allowing for perishable fencing that's long gone. These are major public works, moving tens of thousands of stones, aligning walls across uneven ground, and keeping bearings over distance implies surveying skill and leadership able to mobilize labor from multiple communities. These weren't weekend projects. They look communal, planned and socially binding, something closer to a seasonal infrastructure for whole valleys than a simple hunting trick. Second, placement. Many kites sit where you'd expect, on game routes, at the lip of escarpments, across natural bottlenecks. Others are perched out on open flats, or their driving lines face areas where, today at least, large herds seem unlikely to have traveled. Some point across bare lava fields. That could mean past ecologies were richer, steppe supporting more fauna than the modern desert does. It could also imply secondary functions. Territory markers, boundary monuments, or structures with seasonal visibility, working in certain winds, along certain water courses, or in specific migration windows. Third, evidence gaps. For every kite head with bones, many more are sterile. No obvious butchery deposits, no tools, no ash. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Bones break down, heads get reused or robbed, but the pattern leaves room for alternative readings. In a handful of regions, long axes of kites loosely echo cardinal directions or seasonal solar paths, not with the laser precision of an observatory, more like a tendency than a rule, but enough to keep debate alive. Were some kites also calendrical or ceremonial landscapes, activated in certain times, with processions and gatherings that reinforced alliances? Construction details speak to an iterative technology. Driving walls are typically made of local fieldstone, basalt in the Hara, limestone on chalk plains, stacked in single or double courses. Heads vary. Some are simple enclosures, others are complex, with cells and inner chambers that force tight turns, useful when managing a panicked animal's sightline. In a few cases, later people have nest built into older structures. Pastoralists reusing cells as livestock pens, small cairns added on wall lines, or burial monuments, pendants, mustatils, or tumuli intruding into kite plans. That palimpsest complicates interpretation. Which stones belong to the hunting system, and which are later edits to the landscape? There's also the question of organization. A single successful drive might produce meat far beyond immediate needs. That implies storage, drying, or large-scale feasting, activities that knit together communities and anchor seasonal calendars. Archaeologists have proposed that kite hunts may have coincided with ritual gatherings, harvest equivalents for hunter-pastoral societies, where marriages were arranged, disputes settled, and alliances renewed. If so, the kites were more than tools. They were social theaters. On the flip side, not every kite needs share a function. In some districts, overlapping funnels point to different heads, as if communities claimed lines across the same grazing front at different times. In others, long, straight driving walls kink around older cairns or natural obstacles, hinting at compromises with sacred spots or earlier land use. The pattern reads like centuries of negotiation between practical needs and inherited ritual geographies. Dating highlights sharpen the range. In the basalt deserts of eastern Jordan, a cluster of kites with adjacent camps has produced Neolithic radiocarbon dates suggesting early use, deep prehistory. In northern Arabia, imagery reveals kite fields embedded among other ancient features, rectangular mustatils and pendant-style tomb chains, implying a continuing tradition of monumental low-wall building from the 6th millennium BC onward, with changing functions across eras. Later, in the Bronze and Iron Ages, when herding lifeways expanded, some kites may have been adapted into corrals, their hunting origins fading into memory. One persistent observation: visibility. Kites make the most sense from above, from a hilltop, a ridge, or a pilot's cockpit. That doesn't mean ancient builders needed a bird's view. Surveyors on the ground can set alignments over long distances with reference points and sighting poles. But the way the forms click into legibility from height gives them an uncanny, almost geoglyphic character. They are both machines and marks, functional works that also stamp a cultural signature onto the land. What about animals? Faunal remains where they survive point mainly to gazelle, especially Dorcas and goitered gazelle, species once abundant on these steppes. In a few cases, equids, onagere, and caprids show up too. Rock art occasionally depicts dogs alongside human lines, suggesting canids were part of the drive. The logistics are plausible. A coordinated human front, aided by dogs and low walls, can steer a herd across open country as long as the escape options stay psychologically limited. Taken together, the kites feel like the world's largest hunting architecture, regional in scale, multi-community in labor, seasonal in activation. And yet, the outliers, sterile heads, odd placements, broad alignments, leave a crack in that door. Were some kites ceremonial corridors where people moved rather than animals? Were certain heads designed less as traps and more as arrival courts for festivals tied to migration or stars? Or are we simply missing the perishable fraction, brush fences, wooden palisades, and organic debris that would settle the matter if it had survived? What's not in doubt is the ambition. Across thousands of square kilometers, generations of builders turned stone and open steppe into land-scale instruments, harnessing animal behavior, topography, and group coordination. Whether for meat, meaning, or both, the result is a patterned desert that only fully reveals itself from a vantage point ancient users rarely had, but clearly understood. So what are we looking at? The greatest hunting traps ever devised, or vast geoglyphs whose practical use was only part of their story? The answer may lie somewhere in the overlap, landscapes that fed people and bound them together, recording routes and seasons in lines of stone. From the stone-built hunting lines of the Middle East, we head east into the cradle of civilization itself, Mesopotamia. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, cities rose from the floodplains. Writing was pressed into clay for the first time, and kingship itself was described as a gift from the gods. Among the thousands of tablets unearthed from these ancient ruins, one stands apart for its audacity and mystery, the Sumerian king list. The most complete version we know was compiled around 1800 BC, during the Isin dynasty, though fragments of similar lists have been found at multiple sites. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward historical record, tracing the succession of rulers and cities that held power over Sumer. But this list does something remarkable. It doesn't just reach back a few centuries. It reaches into a shadowy past before the flood. The Great Flood is the dividing line in the narrative, described as an event that wiped away all earlier dynasties. After this cataclysm, kingship was said to be lowered from heaven again, beginning a new era. It's when you look at the details that the strangeness begins. Post-flood kings often match what we know from archaeology. Their names appear on monuments, in administrative tablets, in the ruins of cities like Uruk and Ur. But the pre-flood kings are another matter entirely. Their reigns are given in the thousands, or even tens of thousands of years. One king of Larak is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Another, from Shuruppak, for 18,600. These figures are clearly beyond human lifespans, yet they are presented as matter-of-fact history. Why would anyone record such impossible reign lengths? Some scholars think the numbers are symbolic, meant to show divine favor, or to mark the antediluvian kings as belonging to a different, more godlike age. Others suggest they might reflect a different way of counting time, such as lunar months instead of solar years. Though even then, the reigns remain extraordinarily long. There is also the idea that these could be mythologized memories of real leaders whose deeds were magnified over centuries of storytelling. The flood itself is another point of intrigue. It mirrors the story told in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero meets Utnapishtim, a survivor of a divine deluge sent to cleanse the earth. It appears again in the Atrahasis epic. And of course, it has uncanny similarities to the biblical story of Noah, as well as flood legends from India, Greece, and even the Americas. Were these just common human myths, or do they preserve some shared memory of a real event? Archaeological evidence shows that around 2900 BC, several Mesopotamian cities, including Shuruppak and Kish, were struck by massive floods, leaving thick layers of river silt. But these were local, not global, disasters. The king list may have served political purposes as well. The sequence of cities often mirrors the historical dominance of those cities, conveniently ending with the dynasty of the king who commissioned the tablet. It could be propaganda, asserting an unbroken divine mandate for the current ruler. Omissions may also have been deliberate. Rival cities and usurpers simply left out to erase them from memory. Yet the text has also proven unexpectedly accurate in some respects. Cities once thought mythical, like Larak and Shuruppak, were later found by archaeologists. This gives weight to the possibility that, even if the details are wrapped in myth, the list preserves genuine memories of very early urban centers. Multiple copies of the king list survive, each with small but telling differences. Some alter reign lengths, others omit or add dynasties. This suggests the list was updated and reinterpreted over time, adapted to fit the needs and political landscapes of different periods. The core story, kingship from heaven, the flood, and the transfer of power between cities, remains consistent. For post-flood rulers, archaeological evidence offers a clearer picture. Kings like Enme-Baragesi of Kish, Mesanapada of Ur, and even Gilgamesh of Uruk have been tied to real inscriptions and building projects. Their reigns fit within what we know of early dynastic Mesopotamia. But for the pre-flood era, there is nothing tangible beyond the king list itself. The cities are real, but the impossibly long reigns remain unsupported by material finds. Comparisons with other ancient cultures reveal similar blends of myth and history. Egyptian king lists sometimes begin with gods and demigods ruling for vast stretches of time. In later Babylonian chronicles, history was also rewritten to suit current rulers. But the Sumerian version, with its rigid pre- and post-flood division, is unique in its clarity and in the scale of the reigns it records. This leads to the central question. Is the Sumerian king list simply a work of political myth-making, using the grandeur of an imagined past to legitimize the present? Or does it contain a coded record of real events from a time so far back that it now sits beyond the reach of archaeology? Could the pre-flood kings be the dimly remembered rulers of an older, lost civilization wiped away by disaster? Until more evidence emerges, an older version of the list, or archaeological finds that can be firmly linked to the antediluvian rulers, the text will remain suspended between history and legend. It is one of the oldest surviving attempts to write a definitive human history. Yet it may be telling us as much about how ancient people shaped the past as about the past itself. And from these ancient records pressed into clay, our story moves forward in time to the 20th century, to a different kind of priceless record, one that might have answered fundamental questions about human evolution had it not vanished without a trace. The missing fossils of Peking man. Imagine this, the most complete collection of early human fossils ever found in East Asia, carefully excavated over more than a decade, meticulously cataloged, packed into crates for safe passage overseas, and then gone. Not misplaced in a drawer or mislabeled in a museum basement, but vanished without a trace somewhere between Beijing and the other side of the Pacific during one of the most chaotic moments of the 20th century. This is the enduring mystery of the Peking man bones. The story begins in the 1920s, when a Canadian anatomist named Davidson Black joined a multinational team exploring the Zhoukoudian cave system, about 30 miles southwest of Beijing. Local quarrymen had long known the site contained unusual bones and stone tools, but scientific excavation revealed something remarkable. Fossilized remains of Homo erectus pekinensis, a direct ancestor of modern humans, dating back roughly 750,000 years. Over the next decade, under the direction of Black and later Chinese paleontologist Pei Wenzhong, hundreds of fossil pieces were recovered: skull caps, jaws, teeth, and limb bones from at least 40 individuals. These finds were revolutionary. They offered concrete evidence that human ancestors had lived in northern China for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to Ice Age climates and developing tool use long before Homo sapiens emerged. Alongside the bones were thousands of stone tools and evidence of fire use, ash layers, charred bones, and burnt stone, pushing back the timeline for controlled use of fire in human history. For paleoanthropology, Peking man was a treasure trove. By the late 1930s, tensions in China had escalated into the Second Sino-Japanese War, part of the broader global conflict that became World War II. As Japanese forces approached Beijing, the scientists at the Peking Union Medical College and the Cenozoic Research Laboratory feared for the safety of their irreplaceable fossils. Plans were made to ship them to the United States for safekeeping until the war ended. The fossils were carefully packed into 2 wooden crates, cushioned with materials to protect them on the long journey, and entrusted to the U.S. Marine Corps for transport to the port of Qinhuangdao. From there, they were meant to be loaded onto a ship bound for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Somewhere in that handover, the trail goes cold. The Marines transporting the crates were captured by Japanese forces in December 1941, just as war broke out between Japan and the United States. From that point onward, the fate of the Peking man fossils becomes a haze of rumor, conflicting testimonies, and dead ends. One theory is the simplest. The crates never left China. They may have been seized by the Japanese military, either destroyed in the chaos of war, or spirited away to Japan, where they could still be hidden in a private collection or institutional archive. Another theory holds that the crates did make it to the coast, but were loaded onto a vessel that was sunk by enemy action, the exact ship often identified as the SS President Harrison, which ran aground and was captured in the early days of the Pacific War. Some believe the fossils went down with it. Then there are the stranger claims. In the post-war years, rumors circulated that the crates had been buried somewhere in Beijing, possibly in the grounds of the U.S. Embassy, or under what is now a parking lot. Others suggest they were hidden by well-meaning Chinese officials or locals to protect them, but the knowledge of their location was lost when those individuals died. In the 1970s and 80s, renewed searches were conducted. One even involved ground-penetrating radar at rumored burial sites, but nothing was found. The loss was, and still is, a devastating blow to science. Detailed casts of many of the bones had been made before the war, and these remain invaluable for study, but they can't reveal everything the originals could have. Modern techniques like CT scanning, isotopic analysis, and DNA extraction might have yielded insights into Homo erectus, diet, migration, and genetic relationships to other early humans. The chance to apply these methods to such a large and well-preserved sample has been lost for over 80 years. Some researchers have pointed out the eerie parallels to other cases where priceless artifacts vanished in wartime. The Amber Room of Tsarskoye Selo, looted by the Nazis, has never been found. Entire libraries and museum collections disappeared in bombings and looting sprees, their contents scattered across the globe. Could the Peking man bones simply be another casualty of this cultural devastation, sitting unrecognized in a forgotten box in some archive? Even today, the story refuses to die. Every so often, a new lead emerges, a diary entry from a soldier, an offhand comment by a veteran, a hint from someone claiming family knowledge of the crates. None have panned out. The Chinese government has periodically renewed its appeal for information, framing the fossils as a national treasure of both scientific and cultural importance. International paleoanthropologists agree, if the bones still exist, they belong to all of humanity's story. The Peking man site itself, at Zhoukoudian, remains active. Excavations resumed after the war and continue to this day, uncovering more tools, animal bones, and environmental evidence that add to our understanding of the world Homo erectus inhabited. But the original bones, the ones that could connect all those dots with unparalleled clarity, remain stubbornly absent. This absence fuels speculation. Were they deliberately destroyed to prevent them falling into enemy hands? Sold on the black market, where they might now sit in the vault of a private collector who doesn't grasp their significance? Or are they still buried, somewhere mundane and overlooked, waiting for an accident or a lucky tip to bring them to light again? For now, the crates that left Beijing in 1941 are like a ghost ship in the historical record, fully provisioned, their course plotted, but never arriving at their destination. Their loss is a reminder of how fragile even the most important discoveries can be, and how easily the tangible evidence of our deep past can slip beyond our reach. We turn to a mystery of a completely different kind, not one of missing fossils, but of a living language whose origins are just as elusive, the unique and ancient speech of the Basque people. In the rugged hills and green valleys straddling the western Pyrenees, on the border of Spain and France, people speak a language unlike any other in Europe. It isn't related to Spanish, French, or any of the hundreds of Indo-European languages that dominate the continent. In fact, it isn't related to anything at all. This is Euskara, the language of the Basques, and it stands alone as one of the world's great linguistic enigmas. Euskara is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no proven relatives, no clear ancestor, no branch on the family tree of languages. Every other modern European language, from Icelandic to Russian, can ultimately be traced back to a common ancestor in the Indo-European family. But Euskara exists completely apart from that lineage, making it a living fossil of speech, one that seems to predate the linguistic waves that reshaped the rest of the continent. Its survival is extraordinary. The Basque country lies in a region long fought over by powerful empires. The Romans marched through, building roads and cities. The Visigoths ruled from the collapse of Rome until the Muslim conquest. The Moors advanced into the Iberian Peninsula, and later, the Spanish and French crowns absorbed the territory. Each of these brought dominant languages and cultures, yet Euskara persisted, spoken in homes, markets, and gatherings for millennia. What we know about its origins is surprisingly little. The earliest written examples of Euskara appear not in ancient stone inscriptions, but in medieval texts from around the 10th century, often embedded as single words or phrases in Latin documents. This is remarkably late for a language of its age, and it means we have no ancient records to trace its earlier form. Some scholars believe Euskara is the last remnant of the languages spoken in Western Europe before the spread of Indo-European tongues thousands of years ago, possibly even as far back as the Paleolithic, when hunter-gatherers roamed the region. Hints of this deep antiquity survive in place names. Across the Basque country and beyond, there are geographic names with roots that appear to be pre-Indo-European, suggesting that Euskara's ancestral form once covered a much larger area. Certain river names, mountain names, and ancient local terms don't fit into any Indo-European pattern, reinforcing the idea that the language, or its close relatives, may have once been widespread across parts of Europe. And yet, despite decades of study, linguists have not been able to tie Euskara definitively to any other known language. Over the years, theories have linked it to everything from the Berber languages of North Africa to distant Caucasian tongues like Georgian. Some of these ideas are based on superficial similarities in vocabulary or grammar, but none have held up under rigorous linguistic analysis. Each time a connection seems promising, the evidence turns out to be coincidental or too thin to be convincing. The mystery deepens when you consider how Euskara avoided extinction. Language isolates are often fragile, easily swept away by the dominance of larger language families. But the Basque people's geography worked in their favor. The mountains and valleys provided natural barriers, limiting the spread of outsiders' languages in rural areas. Even when surrounding regions adopted Latin during the Roman era, Euskara held on in the countryside. Later, under both Spanish and French rule, Basque communities maintained their linguistic identity through tight-knit social structures, oral traditions, and a strong sense of cultural pride. There are also tantalizing clues in archaeology and genetics. Studies of ancient DNA from the region show a degree of continuity between the populations of the late Neolithic and those living there today, suggesting that the Basques may be direct descendants of some of Europe's earliest farmers, or even of the last hunter-gatherers to adopt farming. If true, it would make sense that their language could be a holdover from a time before Indo-European expansion. However, language and genetics don't always align perfectly. People can adopt new languages without changing much genetically, and vice versa. Another eerie detail is how insulated Euskara seems to have been from linguistic borrowing, given its long history of contact with other languages. While it has absorbed words from Latin, Spanish, and French over the centuries, its core structure and vocabulary remain stubbornly independent. Its grammar is famously complex, featuring an ergative absolutive system that marks subjects and objects differently than most European languages, and a verb system with elaborate agreement markers. It's a structure that would feel completely foreign to speakers of English, French, or German, and it's one reason Euskara has been so resistant to classification. Without ancient inscriptions, we are left with speculation about how old the language truly is and how far back its roots go. Was Euskara already spoken in its current homeland when the first megaliths were raised in Europe? Was it the tongue of early farmers who spread from the Near East into the Atlantic fringe? Or does it stretch even further back, to the Ice Age refuges where small populations clung to survival along the coasts? We also don't know whether Euskara once had relatives that died out. It's possible that other pre-Indo-European languages once dotted the map of Western Europe, each eventually giving way to Latin or Celtic tongues, leaving Euskara as the last survivor. In that sense, it might not be truly unique in its origin, only in its persistence. For the Basque people themselves, the language is more than a puzzle for linguists. It's a living thread of identity. It carries oral traditions, songs, and cultural concepts that don't translate neatly into other languages. Its survival into the 21st century, despite centuries of political pressure and, at times, outright suppression, is a testament to the resilience of its speakers. And yet, for all this resilience, the riddle remains. Where did Euskara come from? Without older written records or a breakthrough in comparative linguistics, the answer may remain hidden in the deep past. Perhaps it is, as some have called it, Europe's linguistic fossil. A voice from a time before the rest of the continent spoke anything we'd recognize today. From a language that seems to have slipped through the cracks of history, we'll move next to a legend from the American Southwest, one that blends oral tradition, myth, and hints of ancient survival in ways that raise questions of their own. The story of the Hopi ant people. In the high desert of the American Southwest, among mesas, canyons, and stretches of sun-baked earth, the Hopi people have carried their traditions forward for countless generations. Their oral history is vast, rich, and layered, full of ceremonial knowledge, clan stories, and explanations for how the world came to be as it is. Among these traditions, one stands out for its vivid imagery and uncanny parallels to other ancient global myths, the legend of the ant people. According to Hopi tradition, humanity has lived through multiple worlds, each destroyed by some kind of cataclysm. The people of the first world perished in fire, sometimes interpreted as volcanic activity, sometimes as a celestial event. The second ended in ice, with glaciers or extreme winters covering the land. The third, the one most often recounted in connection with the ant people, was brought down by a great flood. In each disaster, a few survivors were spared, and in the case of both the first and second cataclysms, these survivors owed their lives to the ant people, who took them deep underground and sheltered them until it was safe to return to the surface. The descriptions of the ant people are intriguing. In Hopi, they are called Anu Sinam, ant people, a name that immediately suggests physical or behavioral similarities to ants. Some versions of the story describe them as having lean, strong bodies and large heads, with eyes that shone in the dim light of their subterranean dwellings. Like real ants, they are said to have been industrious, cooperative, and capable of storing large supplies of food. In fact, one detail in the legend mentions that during the refuge period, the ant people taught humans how to sprout seeds and preserve food in ways that would sustain them for long stretches underground. The underground element of the story connects in fascinating ways to the archaeological record of the Southwest. Across ancient Hopi settlements and other Puebloan cultures, we find kivas, ceremonial chambers built partly or entirely below ground. In Hopi cosmology, kivas are symbolic of the sipapu, the place of emergence from the previous world to the current one. While kivas are used for ritual today, some researchers have speculated that the memory of emerging from underground after a disaster could have helped inspire their design. Then there are the cliff dwellings, like those at Mesa Verde or Cañón de Chelly. While archaeologists attribute these to later ancestral Puebloan adaptations for defense and resource control, the image of people sheltering in enclosed spaces carved into stone has an evocative echo of the ant people's underground refuge. Whether intentional or coincidental, the parallels invite comparison. What makes the ant people story especially captivating is its potential connection to global catastrophe myths. In the Hopi version, the Third World was destroyed by a flood, and the survivors were those who had either taken shelter with the ant people or otherwise escaped to high ground. This mirrors the flood narratives told by cultures thousands of miles apart: the Mesopotamian flood of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the biblical Noah story, ancient Chinese deluge legends, and Aboriginal Australian accounts of rising seas. Could these be distant cultural memories of the same event, refracted through different traditions? If the flood element has some basis in real geological history, such as the rapid sea level rise after the last ice age or more localized catastrophic floods, then the ant people legend might encode details of how certain communities survived. The ant people themselves could be a symbolic stand-in for another group of humans who already lived in caves or subterranean spaces, perhaps due to climate or cultural practices, and who took in refugees during a crisis. Alternatively, they could represent the idea of cooperating with nature, adopting the ants' method of storing food and retreating underground when danger looms. Of course, in the absence of written records from the deep past, these interpretations remain speculative. Hopi oral history isn't just about recording literal events. It also conveys spiritual truths, moral lessons, and instructions for living in harmony with the world. In that sense, the ant people can also be understood as models of selflessness, discipline, and preparedness, traits that the Hopi view as essential for survival. Yet there are details that keep the literalist possibilities alive. Some versions of the legend note that the underground dwellings of the ant people were lit by an unknown source of light, allowing crops to be grown even beneath the surface. To modern ears, this sounds fantastical, but in storytelling traditions, such descriptions often point to something unusual enough in real life to inspire wonder. Was this simply a poetic way to describe the warmth and dim glow of firelight in enclosed spaces? Or is it a remnant of an old tale about meeting people who had technologies or techniques unfamiliar to the Hopi ancestors? The mystery deepens when you consider that the Hopi aren't the only Native American group with stories about beings who live underground and help humanity. The Zuni, another Puebloan people, have tales of emerging from an underworld to inhabit the present one. Navajo traditions also speak of earlier worlds and beings that guided humans during transitions. While the specifics differ, the recurrence of the underground refuge motif suggests a shared or parallel heritage of ideas. Adding yet another layer, some researchers outside mainstream archaeology have speculated about connections between the ant people legend and ancient migrations, even proposing that it preserves a memory of contact with peoples from distant lands. These theories are controversial, often lacking direct evidence, but they illustrate the allure of the mystery. If a group with unique cultural practices had indeed arrived in the Southwest millennia ago, could they have influenced the stories passed down to the Hopi? Still, the ant people remain elusive in the physical record. No archaeological discovery has definitively linked to their existence as described in Hopi lore. Instead, the traces we see, the kivas, the cliff dwellings, the subterranean storage pits, are interpreted through the lens of known cultures and their survival strategies in a challenging environment. The Hopi themselves, however, continue to tell the story as part of their living tradition, one that blends history, spirituality, and identity. It is this blending that makes the legend so compelling. It sits at the crossroads of myth and possible memory, of symbolic teaching and literal survival account. It challenges us to think about how knowledge is preserved when there are no written words, how stories can carry the essence of events across hundreds or thousands of years. Whether the ant people were supernatural helpers, human allies, or entirely allegorical, they endure in the Hopi worldview as keepers of an ancient pact to protect and guide humanity through its darkest times. And so the question lingers. Could there once have been a real people whose generosity and unique way of life were so vital in a time of crisis that their memory became immortalized as the ant people? Or are they an eternal reminder, built into Hopi tradition, that survival depends on cooperation, foresight, and harmony with the natural world? Our journey takes us far from the mesas of Arizona to the windswept coast of New England, where a single coin, out of place and out of time, raises its own set of questions about the reach of ancient travelers and the stories they left behind. In the quiet coastal town of Brooklyn, Maine, in 1957, an amateur archaeologist named Guy Melgren made a discovery that would become one of the most debated finds in North American archaeology. Melgren had been excavating at what was known as the Goddard Site, an old Native American settlement on a tidal peninsula, when he unearthed an unfamiliar silver coin among fragments of pottery, tools, and other artifacts. The site itself dated to around the 12th century, long before Europeans were thought to have ventured this far south along the Atlantic coast. When experts examined the coin, the surprise was immediate. It was Norwegian, struck during the reign of King Olaf Kira, between 1067 and 1093 AD. This placed it firmly in the Viking Age, the same period as the confirmed Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. But Brooklyn, Maine is nearly 1,000 kilometers south of that site, far beyond any documented Norse exploration. Even more perplexing, it had been found in a context surrounded entirely by indigenous artifacts, with no sign of a Norse camp or settlement nearby. The Goddard site itself had been a seasonal encampment for Native Americans for centuries, used for fishing and gathering shellfish. Archaeologists determined that the coin was likely deposited there sometime around 1180 to 1235 AD, at least 80 years after it was minted. This suggested that, whatever its origin, it had already been in circulation for decades before arriving in Maine. How it made that journey remains one of the great mysteries. One theory is that the coin arrived through direct Norse contact. We know the Norse sailed from Greenland to Newfoundland, and possibly beyond, in small exploratory voyages. It's conceivable that a Norse trader or explorer could have reached the Gulf of Maine, bartered with local tribes, and left the coin behind. However, no physical evidence, no Norse tools, structures, or other artifacts has ever been found in the region to support such a visit. Another possibility is that the coin traveled hand to hand through a vast indigenous trade network. Archaeological evidence shows that pre-Columbian North America had far-reaching exchange systems, moving goods like obsidian, copper, and shells across thousands of miles. If the Norse traded with tribes in Newfoundland or Labrador, the coin might have slowly made its way south via trade, eventually ending up in Maine. Yet, even this scenario raises questions. Why is there only one Old World artifact of this kind ever found in the entire United States outside of Norse settlements in Greenland and Newfoundland? The uniqueness of the Maine penny is part of its allure. Unlike disputed artifacts, such as the Kensington Runestone or the Vinland map, the coin itself is unquestionably authentic and properly dated. The mystery lies entirely in how it ended up where it did. Some have speculated about lost Norse expeditions, shipwrecks along the New England coast, or even long-forgotten mixed communities of Norse and native peoples. The circumstances of its discovery have also fueled debate. Mellgren did not immediately recognize the significance of the coin, and it sat in his collection for years before being formally identified. While some critics have suggested it could have been a modern plant, most experts agree the archaeological context was genuine. The Maine State Museum, which houses the coin today, maintains that it was found exactly as reported, in situ with other indigenous materials from the Goddard site. Adding to the intrigue, similar medieval European coins have turned up in unexpected places elsewhere in North America, though most of those cases have been traced to modern losses or hoaxes. The Maine penny stands apart because of its secure archaeological provenance and its fit within the timeline of Norse exploration. Still, it's the only piece of hard evidence suggesting a connection between the Norse and the indigenous peoples of what is now the northeastern United States. Some scholars have tried to tie the penny to Norse sagas describing voyages to Vinland and beyond. These texts mention regions with plentiful resources, warmer climates, and interactions, sometimes hostile, with native peoples. If the Norse did sail as far as Maine, the environment would have matched the saga's descriptions better than the harsher conditions of Newfoundland. But the sagas are not precise maps, and their blending of fact and myth makes them difficult to use as hard evidence. There's also the matter of King Olaf Kyrre's reign itself. Olaf was known for a relatively peaceful period in Norway's history, focusing on trade and internal development, rather than large-scale raiding. Coins minted during his time were not common in Greenland. The Norse colony there relied more on barter than coinage. This raises another puzzle. Was the Maine penny brought over directly from Norway on a rare voyage, or had it already been moving among Norse communities for years before crossing the Atlantic? Decades of searching have turned up no second coin, no accompanying Norse artifacts, no ship remains, and no other definitive proof of direct contact. And yet, that single silver disc continues to quietly suggest a link, however tenuous, between two worlds we rarely imagine meeting so far south before Columbus. It's that singularity that keeps the Maine penny in the spotlight of historical mystery. A lone 11th century Norwegian coin, resting for centuries in the soil of a Native American fishing camp, stands as either a tantalizing clue to a forgotten voyage or a testament to the extraordinary reach of indigenous trade networks. Without more evidence, we may never know which is true. And as we leave the windswept coast of Maine behind, our next mystery takes us halfway across the world, to the ruins of one of the world's earliest great urban civilizations, where a small bronze statue still dances in defiance of 4,500 years of silence. When archaeologists first uncovered the tiny bronze figure now known as the Dancing Girl in 1926, it was in the midst of the ruins of Mohenjo-daro, one of the great urban centers of the Indus Valley civilization. This city, thriving around 2500 BC, was already rewriting history with its precise urban planning, standardized weights and measures, and complex drainage systems. Yet, amidst the bricks, pottery, and seals, this 10.5 centimeter statue stood out immediately. She wasn't a generic religious idol or a simple decorative trinket. She had attitude. The figure shows a young woman, naked except for a profusion of bangles climbing nearly to her shoulder, a necklace, and a small pigtail resting on her shoulder. One hand rests on her hip. The other hangs loosely at her side. Her head tilts slightly upward, and her stance, weight on one leg, hip pushed out, is self-assured, almost defiant. It's a posture that feels shockingly modern for a piece cast over 4,000 years ago. The craftsmanship was no accident. She was made using the lost wax casting technique, a method that involves creating a wax model, covering it in clay, firing it so the wax melts away, and then pouring molten metal into the cavity. This was advanced technology for the time, especially for such a small but detailed object. The Indus Valley people clearly had skilled metalworkers, and this piece proves they could produce art as sophisticated as any Bronze Age culture. Her jewelry also tells a story. The abundance of bangles, probably made from different materials in real life, hints at social or cultural significance. Bangles in South Asia have long been associated with femininity, status, and sometimes even marital status. The necklace and hair detail add to the sense that this figure was meant to be specific, not generic. But who was she? Was this a portrait of a real woman? Perhaps a performer, a high-status individual, or someone important to the artist? Or was she a symbolic representation of dance, youth, or vitality? The Indus Valley civilization left behind no deciphered written records to explain their art. Their script, found on seals and tablets, remains unreadable, so we have no contemporary explanation for the figure's purpose. Her confident pose raises further questions. Ancient depictions of women often followed rigid artistic conventions: modest, symmetrical, formal. The dancing girl breaks those rules. She's informal, asymmetrical, and dynamic. That has led some scholars to see her as evidence of a culture that valued performance arts or had social spaces where such expressions were appreciated. Others think she may have had a religious role, perhaps connected to fertility or ritual dance. One of the more intriguing aspects is how little else like her has been found. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa have yielded plenty of figurines, but most are terracotta, not metal, and few carry this same sense of personality. The style doesn't seem to continue into later South Asian art traditions either, which suggests she may represent a unique artistic moment or even a single artisan's vision, lost when the civilization declined. The context of her discovery also matters. She was found in a house, not a temple or public space, suggesting she might have been a personal possession rather than a communal or religious object. This could mean she was a cherished ornament, perhaps even a toy, though her fine craftsmanship argues against something meant for children. The mystery deepens when we consider what else was happening in the world in 2500 BC. Egypt was building pyramids, Mesopotamia was refining its cuneiform writing, and yet here, in the Indus Valley, people were producing art that seems almost out of step with the more rigid iconography of other civilizations. Could the dancing girl be evidence that the Indus people had different cultural priorities, perhaps more egalitarian or expressive in certain spheres? Some researchers have tried to connect her to later Indian dance traditions, like Bharatanatyam or Odissi, noting similarities in posture. But the gap of millennia and the collapse of the Indus cities make this link speculative. Without a written tradition to bridge that time, any direct connection is uncertain. Her very survival is also remarkable. Bronze is valuable and easily melted down for reuse, especially in ancient times when metal was scarce. The fact that this figure remained intact and was ultimately buried, perhaps deliberately, means someone valued it enough to keep it whole. Adding to the mystery is the absence of clear parallels in neighboring cultures. Mesopotamian bronzes of the era tend to be more formal and less individualized. Egyptian art of the time is highly stylized. The dancing girl's realism and attitude put her in a category of her own. We also can't ignore the broader mystery of the Indus Valley civilization itself. Despite being one of the world's great ancient cultures, we know astonishingly little about their political structures, religion, or daily life. Their cities show signs of sophisticated governance, but their collapse around 1900 BC is still debated. Climate change, shifting rivers, or outside invasions have all been suggested. If the civilization had continued, perhaps the artistic tradition she represents would have flourished, and we'd have more examples to study. Instead, she stands alone, a bronze survivor from a vanished world, raising more questions than she answers. Was she meant to inspire, to commemorate? Or is she simply the work of an artisan capturing a fleeting image from life? Whatever her origin, she bridges an immense gap of time, showing us that individuality and artistic confidence are not modern inventions. And as we move from the crowded streets of Mohenjo-daro to our next mystery, we'll leave behind this single self-assured figure, still frozen mid-pose after 4,500 years, and travel to a different ancient landscape, where graves carved into salt-rich hills reveal a civilization whose wealth and connections stretched across Europe. High in the Austrian Alps, the serene lakeside village of Hallstatt hides one of the richest archaeological sites in all of Europe, a vast Iron Age cemetery tied to an ancient culture whose name it now bears. Between roughly 800 and 500 BC, more than 1,000 men, women, and children were laid to rest here, many with grave goods so diverse and valuable that they map a web of trade stretching from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. Yet for all their wealth and craftsmanship, the people of Hallstatt left behind no written record, and their political structure, cultural identity, and even the extent of their influence remain shrouded in mystery. The reason Hallstatt existed at all, in such an unlikely mountain location, was salt. Just above the village lies one of the oldest continually worked salt mines in the world. To ancient peoples, salt was as valuable as gold, essential for preserving food, a key to survival through harsh winters, and a trade commodity prized by distant cultures. Control of these mines gave the Hallstatt elite both the means and the leverage to become a powerful center in the European Iron Age. The cemetery reflects this. Burials include ornate bronze and iron weapons, imported pottery, amber from the Baltic coast, coral from the Mediterranean, and even glass beads that may have traveled from as far as the Near East. Some graves are so richly furnished that archaeologists can identify them as belonging to high-status individuals, perhaps chieftains, traders, or clan leaders. The presence of fine Greek and Etruscan ceramics among the grave goods is particularly striking, as it shows that Hallstatt's connections reached well into the classical world centuries before Rome's rise. This was not a remote, isolated mountain community. It was a node in a vast and dynamic network of commerce, ideas, and influence. Yet the sheer scale of Hallstatt's wealth raises questions. How did a settlement in such a rugged location exert influence over regions hundreds of miles away? Did they control the trade routes directly, sending caravans along alpine passes, or did they work through a chain of intermediary cultures? And how centralized was this power? Was there a ruling dynasty controlling the salt mines, or a looser coalition of powerful families bound together by mutual interests? The burials themselves offer tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. In some, warriors are interred with finely crafted swords and helmets, suggesting a martial elite. In others, women are buried with elaborate jewelry, bronze fibulae, belt hooks, and amber necklaces, indicating status and possibly control over social or ritual life. Children, too, are buried with valuable goods, hinting at hereditary privilege. Yet, without inscriptions or surviving records, we can't connect these individuals to names, stories, or deeds. They remain anonymous, their identities erased by time. The absence of writing is one of Hallstatt's enduring mysteries. By the early Iron Age, many Mediterranean cultures had developed writing systems, and trade brought Hallstatt into contact with them. Yet there is no evidence the Hallstatt people adopted writing for their own use. Was literacy confined to the Mediterranean elites they traded with? Or did the Hallstatt people have some form of record-keeping on perishable materials that simply didn't survive? Equally intriguing is the cemetery's mixture of local and foreign goods. Baltic amber could only have arrived through extensive trade networks, possibly along river systems like the Danube. The coral and Greek pottery suggest links across the Alps into the Po Valley and down into Italy. Some iron weapons appear to have been locally made, showing high skill in metallurgy, while others reflect styles from far-off cultures. This blend of influences raises the possibility that Hallstatt wasn't just exporting salt, but importing artisans, warriors, and perhaps even ideas from across Europe. The graves also reflect changing fashions and technologies over time. Early burials emphasize bronze objects, while later ones show an increasing use of iron. This shift parallels broader technological changes across Iron Age Europe, yet in Hallstatt it also seems tied to shifts in social organization. More weapons in later graves could point to increased conflict or the growing importance of warrior status in society. For all the cemetery reveals, there are unsettling absences. Many artifacts are high-quality imports, but we find few direct clues about Hallstatt's own cultural output beyond their metalwork and distinctive art styles. Their artwork, characterized by geometric motifs and stylized animal forms, hints at a shared symbolic language, but without written explanation, its meaning is speculative. Did these designs mark clan affiliation, spiritual beliefs, or personal achievement? We simply don't know. Then there's the question of Hallstatt's decline. Around 500 BC, the Hallstatt culture gave way to what archaeologists call the Latin culture, centered further to the northwest. The transition seems gradual in some areas, abrupt in others. There's no clear evidence of invasion or catastrophic collapse in Hallstatt itself, yet its prominence fades from the archaeological record. Was it a case of economic shifts? New trade routes bypassing the Alps, perhaps? Or political change within the region? Or did environmental factors, like mine exhaustion or climate fluctuations, play a role? Even the salt mines add their own mysteries. Archaeological work inside them has uncovered well-preserved organic materials, leather shoes, wooden tools, and even pieces of fabric, thanks to the preservative power of salt. These finds give us rare insight into daily life, showing that Hallstatt's people dressed in finely woven textiles, used advanced tools, and worked in organized teams underground. Yet the mines also contain layers of abandoned workings, suggesting periods when mining halted. Were these pauses due to resource depletion, labor shortages, or wider disruptions in the Hallstatt world? The eerie silence of the written record leaves us with only these material clues. Together, they sketch a picture of a wealthy, outward-looking culture, deeply connected to its environment, yet far from isolated. The Hallstatt Cemetery captures this duality. Local traditions blended with foreign luxury, rooted in alpine salt, but reaching across the continent. As we stand among the graves today, it's hard not to wonder about the lives behind the artifacts. Who drank from the imported Greek cups? Who wore the amber beads? What alliances or rivalries spanned the mountain passes? Without names, we can't reconstruct their biographies, but the richness of their material world insists that they were active participants in the great currents of Iron Age Europe. And then there's the lingering question: how far did their influence truly extend? The goods in their graves suggest a reach from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, but were they known and feared even further afield? Did tales of the salt lords of the Alps travel as far as the halls of Etruscan kings or the courts of Greek city-states? For now, Hallstatt's people remain both intimately familiar. We can picture their clothes, their tools, their meals, and profoundly alien, their voices lost to time. We can trace the paths their goods traveled, but not the stories they told along the way. And so, the graves above the salt mines remain more than archaeological treasures. They are open-ended chapters in a story still waiting to be told. Our journey moves next to the humid lowlands of Mesoamerica, where enormous stone heads, each with a unique face, stare out from the past, guardians of another culture whose origins and purpose still spark debate today. In the humid lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast, scattered across the states of Veracruz and Tabasco, stand some of the most iconic and perplexing monuments of the ancient Americas, the Olmec Colossal heads. The first was uncovered in the 1860s at Tres Zapotes, its massive, rounded features staring blankly through centuries of soil and vegetation. Since then, archaeologists have identified 17 of these monumental sculptures, each unique, each unmistakably human, and each raising more questions than it answers. The Olmec civilization, often called Mesoamerica's mother culture, flourished between roughly 1200 and 400 BC. Long before the rise of the Maya or the Aztec, The Olmec established complex urban centers like San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. They practiced large-scale agriculture, engaged in long-distance trade, and developed an artistic style that would influence Mesoamerican culture for centuries. Yet, they left no known written history we can fully read, making their surviving monuments our primary clues. And none of those clues are more striking than the colossal heads. These sculptures are carved from massive basalt boulders, some weighing up to 40 tons. The stone itself was sourced from the Tuxtla Mountains, as much as 50 miles from the sites where the heads now rest. Without wheels, beasts of burden, or metal tools, moving these enormous blocks across rivers, swamps, and forests would have been a logistical feat that still boggles the mind. Experimental archaeology suggests the process might have involved dragging the boulders on sledges over prepared earthen causeways or rafting them along waterways. Whatever the method, it demanded a staggering investment of labor and coordination. Up close, the individuality of each head becomes apparent. The faces are distinct, with varying expressions, facial proportions, and headgear styles. Some have downturned mouths, others a slight smile. Some wear close-fitting helmets with chin straps, others elaborate headdresses. The level of detail, from carved ear spools to the folds of the eyelids, suggests that these were portraits, likely of real people. Most scholars believe they represent Olmec rulers, immortalized in stone as symbols of authority and lineage. Others have speculated they might depict ball players, given the similarity of their headgear to the protective helmets used in the Mesoamerican ball game. The sheer scale and permanence of these monuments speak to their cultural importance. Creating a single head would have required not just skilled artisans, but also the ability to command and sustain large work crews, plan long-term projects, and marshal resources over vast distances. In a society without draft animals or modern machinery, such undertakings were as much about demonstrating political power as they were about artistic expression. Yet for all their grandeur, the heads raise as many questions as they answer. If they are portraits of rulers, why so few? Were these the only leaders considered worthy of such honor, or have countless others been lost to time? How were the subjects chosen, and what did the heads mean to the people who lived alongside them? And perhaps most puzzling, why were some of the heads deliberately buried or toppled in antiquity, only to be rediscovered millennia later? Some archaeologists believe the heads were part of broader ceremonial complexes. At San Lorenzo, for example, they were arranged alongside other monumental sculptures, including thrones and altars. The heads may have been displayed in public spaces, perhaps marking political boundaries or serving as focal points for rituals. In other cases, their placement suggests they were meant to face outward from ceremonial centers, as if watching over or guarding the surrounding lands. Adding to the mystery is the abrupt decline of Olmec centers around 400 BC. San Lorenzo had already fallen centuries earlier, its monuments defaced and buried. La Venta, the last major Olmec capital, was abandoned not long after. The reasons remain debated: environmental changes, shifting trade networks, internal unrest. Whatever the cause, the colossal heads endured, silent witnesses to a vanished culture. There are even theories, more speculative in nature, that connect the head's features to distant populations. Some observers have noted broad noses and full lips, leading to controversial suggestions of transoceanic contact. Mainstream archaeology rejects such claims, pointing out that these features fall well within the range of indigenous Mesoamerican diversity. Still, the lifelike individuality of the heads continues to fuel debate about who exactly the Olmec were and how their society functioned. The heads also sit at the center of an intriguing technological puzzle. The basalt was shaped with stone tools, yet the precision of the carving, smooth curves, clean lines, and intricate details rivals work done in later cultures with metal implements. The process would have been slow and labor-intensive, likely involving repeated pecking, grinding, and polishing over many months or even years. That the Olmec invested so much time and effort into each head underscores their significance. Another unanswered question is whether the 17 known heads are all that remain. Given the Olmec's centuries-long dominance and the durability of basalt, it's possible others lie buried in unexplored sites or under layers of jungle growth. Past discoveries have often been accidental, made during agricultural work or construction. Every new head found has added fresh details to the puzzle and hinted at just how much more might be waiting. Even the heads we know have stories layered into their surfaces. Many show signs of recarving, as if later generations modified them to suit new purposes. Some may have started life as throne-like monuments before being reshaped into heads. Others bear damage that appears deliberate, possibly part of ritual deactivation when a ruler died or a city fell. These traces suggest that the heads were not static memorials, but dynamic objects, reinterpreted and repurposed across centuries. And then there's the enduring question of why the Olmec chose heads, and only heads, as the dominant form for such monumental portraiture. While other Olmec art includes full-body figures, masks, and complex scenes, the colossal heads stand apart in scale and focus. Was the face seen as the essence of identity and authority? Were the heads intended to embody the spirit of their subjects, ensuring their continued presence among the living? For modern visitors, encountering a colossal head in person is a humbling experience. The sheer mass of basalt, the careful shaping of each feature, and the knowledge of the immense human effort behind it create a sense of connection across more than 2 millennia. These sculptures are at once deeply personal, unique faces frozen in time, and profoundly public, symbols of a civilization's ability to organize, create, and endure. Yet, in the absence of written records, much about the heads remains speculative. We can trace the basalt back to its source, map the routes it might have traveled, and reconstruct the tools and techniques used to shape it. We can compare the faces, note recurring motifs in the headdresses, and situate the monuments within Olmec ceremonial centers. But the central questions, who these people were, why they were immortalized in stone, and what messages their creators intended, remain unanswered. The colossal heads of the Olmec stand as both triumphs of ancient artistry and tantalizing riddles of the past. They remind us that even the most tangible artifacts can hold mysteries that resist resolution, challenging us to see not just what is carved in stone, but what has been lost between the lines. And from the basalt plains of Veracruz and Tabasco, our path leads on to another enigma of cultural contact. A strange account from Edo period Japan, where a mysterious foreign vessel and its unusual passenger sparked rumors that still echo 2 centuries later. In the early 19th century, Japan was deep in the Edo period, an era defined by political stability, rigid social order, and strict isolation from the outside world. Foreign contact was heavily restricted under the Sakoku policy, meaning that the arrival of any foreign vessel was a rare and notable event. It's against this backdrop that one of Japan's most intriguing and perplexing historical mysteries emerged, the story of the Utsuro-bune, or hollow ship. The year was 1803, when villagers along the coast of Hitachi province, in what is now Ibaraki Prefecture, reported something highly unusual. A strange craft drifted ashore, unlike anything they had ever seen. Edo period records, including Toen Shosetsu and Ume no Chiri, give detailed accounts of the encounter. The vessel was said to be a round, hollow structure about 3 to 5 meters high and over 5 meters in diameter, shaped somewhat like a pot or an incense burner. The lower half was reinforced with metal plates, something unusual for Japanese shipbuilding at the time, while the upper half had windows made of glass or crystal, covered by protective bars, and a sealant of resin. From the top, curious villagers peered in to find an even stranger sight. A young woman, estimated to be around 20 years old, with pale skin, red or light hair, and unusual facial features. She wore elegant, unfamiliar clothing made from fine fabrics the locals could not identify. Most striking of all, she clutched a small ornate box, roughly 60 centimeters in length, which she refused to let anyone touch. Multiple versions of the account stress this detail. She kept the box close to her at all times, even when gesturing or speaking. The woman's language was unintelligible to the villagers, and the writing on the interior walls of the craft and on her belongings was unlike any known Japanese script or foreign writing familiar to scholars of the time. The records describe looping, flowing characters that bore no resemblance to Chinese kanji or Western alphabets. The official accounts include illustrations of the vessel and its passenger, and what's fascinating is that these drawings, preserved in different manuscripts, are remarkably consistent. In an era without photography and with limited communication between regions, such consistency suggests that either the story was widely circulated in a faithful form, or that there was indeed some common basis in reality. As for the vessel itself, historians and maritime scholars have puzzled over its description for decades. Its metal-plated lower section and the tight ceiling suggest it could have been designed for rough seas, perhaps even to float for extended periods without capsizing. Yet no known Japanese, Chinese, or European vessel of the period matches its dimensions and shape. Some have proposed that it could have been a lifeboat or escape craft from a larger foreign ship. Others point to its design as resembling no seagoing craft at all, instead looking almost ceremonial or symbolic. The woman's refusal to part with her box adds another layer to the enigma. Folk interpretations claim it may have held the head of a deceased lover, tying the Utsuro-bune story to older Japanese legends of tragic romances and exile. Others speculate it could have been a religious artifact, a diplomatic gift gone astray, or even a navigational or technological device unknown to Edo Japan, because no one could open it. And because the woman disappeared from the record after the encounter, the box's contents remain purely speculative. Skeptics argue that the Utsuro-bune may have been a piece of creative fiction, part of the Edo period genre of strange tales that blended reported events with literary embellishment. Supporters of this view note that Japan at the time was fascinated by stories of the unusual and foreign, and the isolationist policy meant such tales had a special allure. However, the sheer number of independent written versions, and the technical detail in their descriptions, keeps the possibility alive that the account was based on an actual incident. For more unconventional theorists, the Utsuro-bune has been placed in the same category as modern UFO reports. The craft's unfamiliar design, the strange symbols, the mysterious passenger, all fit comfortably into the narrative of an encounter with something beyond ordinary human technology. Of course, there is no concrete evidence to connect the 1803 event to anything extraterrestrial, but the parallels are compelling enough that the story is regularly mentioned in UFO literature. It's also worth noting that maritime currents in the Pacific could feasibly carry a small vessel from places like Russia's Far East, the Aleutian Islands, or even parts of North America to Japan's eastern coast. Some researchers have suggested the woman may have been from a remote indigenous community or a distant European outpost, cast adrift after a shipwreck. In this scenario, the box could have contained personal valuables or survival tools. Still, the specifics of the craft's construction remain difficult to reconcile with known designs from any of those regions. What happened after the encounter is also hazy. In most versions, the villagers, uncertain of what to do and wary of violating isolationist laws, eventually returned the woman and her vessel to the sea, letting the currents carry her away. Whether she made it back to her origin point or met her end in the Pacific is something we will never know. The absence of any follow-up accounts in later records deepens the mystery. Was this a one-off anomaly, or just the only case that was documented in such detail? The Utsuro-bune incident has remained a source of fascination in Japan and abroad, precisely because it sits at the intersection of folklore, maritime history, and unexplained phenomena. The illustrations offer a tangible hook, the kind of visual cue that keeps a story alive across centuries. The written descriptions, rich in detail yet offering no resolution, invite endless speculation. Even today, visitors to Ibaraki Prefecture can find museums and local displays that reference the story, blending the historical record with the legend. Whether it was a foreign castaway, an experimental craft from an unknown source, or something stranger still, the Utsuro-bune stands as one of Japan's most enduring and unexplained maritime encounters. A mystery set adrift in history, never to return to shore. We now turn to another artifact of exploration, a map from the 16th century that appears to depict lands across the Atlantic with uncanny accuracy, long before official histories say they were charted. In the mid-16th century, a peculiar document appeared in Venice that would puzzle historians and cartographers for centuries, the Zeno Map. Published in 1558 by Niccolò Zeno, the map came with an accompanying narrative claiming it was based on the letters and voyage records of his ancestors, the Venetian brothers Niccolò and Antonio Zeno, who supposedly sailed the far North Atlantic in the late 14th century, long before Columbus's famous journey west. The accompanying text told a tale of exploration that stretched credulity for its time. According to the younger Niccolò, his ancestors had departed from Venice around the 1380s and entered the service of a prince named Zichmani, ruler of an otherwise unknown island nation in the northern seas. From there, they ventured to Greenland, the Faroes, Iceland, and even lands far to the west that many have interpreted as parts of North America. In an era when Europeans were only just beginning to piece together the true scope of the Atlantic, the Zeno map's level of detail seemed extraordinary. At first glance, the map blends the speculative geography of the 16th century with strikingly accurate depictions of certain regions. Greenland, for example, is shown in a roughly correct position and shape. A remarkable feat, considering that most maps of the time rendered it either distorted or wildly misplaced. To the west, a large, vaguely continental mass appears, interpreted by some as a representation of the Canadian Maritimes or even Newfoundland. Between these known points, however, lie several phantom islands, places with exotic names like Friesland, Icaria, and Estadaland, none of which appear on modern charts. The central mystery of the Zeno map revolves around how such knowledge could have been available decades before the accepted timeline of transatlantic exploration. If the Zeno brothers truly sailed these routes in the 14th century, it would mean that Venetian navigators reached parts of the New World almost a century before Columbus, and that their discoveries were largely forgotten until Niccolò Zeno the Younger resurrected them in print. Skeptics have long argued that the entire account might be a fabrication, or at least a creative retelling based on other sources. One possibility is that the younger Zeno pieced together his map from contemporary Portuguese charts and Norse sagas, then inserted his family into the narrative for prestige. Some features on the Zeno map closely resemble cartographic knowledge circulating in the 1500s, suggesting a blend of genuine contemporary information and older, possibly mythical material. Yet certain details resist easy dismissal. The depiction of Greenland's east coast aligns with what Norse settlers and sailors could have known before their colonies in the Western settlement vanished in the early 1400s. The presence of Estadaland and Drogeo in the narrative, lands described with resources and populations reminiscent of parts of North America, echoes descriptions from Norse sagas about Vinland and other Western territories. Could the Zeno map preserve echoes of genuine pre-Columbian voyages by Europeans other than the Norse? The inclusion of Phantom Islands complicates matters further. Friesland, one of the largest and most prominent on the map, persisted in European cartography for over a century, despite no physical evidence of its existence. Some historians see Friesland as a cartographic error, perhaps a misinterpretation of Iceland, while others view it as a conflation of multiple smaller islands. Its persistence, however, hints that mapmakers believed they were working from credible sources, even if those sources were themselves flawed or secondhand. Adding to the intrigue is the figure of Prince Zichmani. No such ruler is known from historical records, yet the narrative paints him as a powerful maritime leader commanding fleets capable of long-range voyages. Some scholars have speculated that Zichmni might have been a distorted reference to an actual ruler in the Orkney or Shetland Islands, regions where Norse influence persisted into the 15th century. If so, the Zeno brothers' alleged service to him could represent a Venetian-Norse link that facilitated the sharing of Atlantic exploration knowledge. For supporters of the map's authenticity, the story fits into a broader pattern of overlooked or forgotten voyages. Just as Norse settlement at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland remained unknown to modern historians until its rediscovery in the 20th century, so too might the Zeno expedition have slipped through the cracks of recorded history. If the voyage did occur, the political and economic priorities of the time, particularly Venice's focus on Mediterranean trade, may have meant little incentive to publicize or follow up on discoveries in the distant and inhospitable North Atlantic. Critics counter that the timing of the map's publication in 1558 is suspicious. By then, European interest in Atlantic exploration was high, and maps with supposed ancient or alternative claims to discovery could be used to stake political or commercial advantages. Presenting the Zeno family as precursors to Columbus may have been a way to assert Venetian prestige in the competitive landscape of Renaissance geopolitics. The enduring fascination with the Zeno map lies in its ambiguous blend of accuracy, fantasy, and possible hidden history. It contains just enough plausible detail to invite serious consideration, while also including enough anomalies to keep its origins shrouded in doubt. Was it a genuine record of a forgotten 14th century Venetian voyage, an artful compilation of Norse and Portuguese knowledge, or a Renaissance-era invention designed to enhance family reputation? No definitive answer has emerged, and perhaps none ever will. The original documents that Niccolò Zeno the Younger claimed to base his work on are long gone, leaving only his map and narrative as evidence. What remains is an artifact that straddles the line between history and legend, a tantalizing suggestion that the story of European exploration in the North Atlantic may be far richer and far stranger than we currently believe. And from a map that may or may not chart forgotten voyages, we move to the enduring question of whether one of history's most celebrated kings was ever a real man at all. The story of King Arthur is perhaps Britain's most enduring national legend, a tapestry woven of heroism, chivalry, betrayal, and the defense of the realm. But beneath the medieval romances, shining armor, and round-table ideals lies a far more elusive question. Did Arthur actually exist? Or is he a literary creation stitched together from scraps of older tales, political propaganda, and cultural memory? Our journey into Arthur's origins begins not in the pages of Le Morte d'Arthur, but in the chaotic centuries after the collapse of Roman rule in Britain. Around the early 5th century CE, Rome withdrew its troops and administrators from the province of Britannia, leaving the native Britons to fend for themselves against waves of new threats: Picts from the north, Irish raiders from the west, and most pressingly, Saxon settlers and warriors from across the North Sea. This was a time of fragmentation and shifting alliances, when local warlords rose and fell quickly, and when chroniclers were few. It is within this shadowy era that Arthur's name, or something like it, begins to flicker into the record. The earliest surviving reference to an Arthur-like figure appears not in a detailed biography, but as a brief mention in a Welsh poem known as Y Gododdin, thought to date from around the 6th or 7th century. In it, a warrior's bravery is praised as being no less than that of Arthur, suggesting that Arthur was already known as a paragon of martial valor. A slightly later source, the Historia Brittonum, compiled in the 9th century by a Welsh monk named Nennius, lists Arthur not as a king, but as a dux bellorum, a war leader who fought alongside various British kings against the Saxons, winning 12 battles in all. These victories, capped by the climactic battle of Mount Badon, are described in sweeping terms, though no specific dates or locations are firmly tied to them. By the 10th century, the Annales Cambriae, Welsh annals, record that the Battle of Baden occurred around 516 CE, and that Arthur bore the image of the Virgin Mary on his shoulders and was victorious. They also note Arthur's death at the Battle of Camlan, and there was great mortality in Britain and Ireland, though again, the details are minimal. There are no contemporary inscriptions, letters, or eyewitness accounts. This gap between the supposed events and the written records, often centuries long, is one of the central challenges in separating Arthur the man from Arthur the myth. The high medieval period saw Arthur's legend expand dramatically. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, History of the Kings of Britain, written in the 12th century, transformed Arthur into a fully fleshed monarch, complete with a noble lineage, a vast empire stretching into Gaul, and a court filled with knights, quests, and political intrigue. Geoffrey also introduced elements like Merlin the Wizard and the sword Caliburn, later Excalibur, blending local tradition with his own inventions. French and English poets soon added Lancelot, Guinevere's tragic love story, the Holy Grail, and the chivalric code, embellishments that gave us the Arthur most people think of today. But Geoffrey's work was as much historical romance as history, and its influence has often blurred the line between fact and fiction. Archaeological evidence for Arthur is elusive. Sites across Britain are linked to his name, from Cadbury Castle in Somerset, thought by some to be the model for Camelot, to Tintagel in Cornwall, where a 5th or 6th century elite settlement has been uncovered. At Tintagel, the discovery of the so-called Artagnu stone in 1998, inscribed with a name that vaguely resembles Arthur, fueled speculation, but most scholars caution that the connection is tenuous. Even Mount Baden's location remains uncertain. Candidates range from Bath to sites in Wiltshire or Dorset, but none can be definitively tied to the historical battle. The core mystery lies in Arthur's identity. If he existed, who was he? Some historians suggest he might have been a Romano-British military commander, defending remnants of Roman order against Saxon expansion. Others propose that Arthur could be a composite figure, merging the deeds of several leaders over decades into one heroic persona. A few go further, arguing that he may have been entirely legendary, a cultural symbol created to embody resistance and unity during centuries of foreign pressure. There are tantalizing anomalies. The name Arthur itself was rare in early medieval Britain, yet it appears in several noble lineages in Wales and Cornwall within a century or two of the supposed Arthur's time. Was this a sign of admiration for a real hero, or the spread of a myth that became an aspirational namesake? And why do none of the near-contemporary chroniclers of the Saxons, such as Gildas, mention him by name, even when discussing the era's conflicts in detail? Modern theories range widely. Some tie Arthur to specific historical figures like Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-British leader praised by Gildas. Others see him as linked to Lucius Artorius Castus, a Roman officer who served in Britain centuries earlier, whose career may have inspired later legends. Folklorists note that elements of the Arthur story, a sword and a stone, a magical protector, a fatal final battle, appear in Celtic mythology long before the 5th century, hinting that Arthur could be the adaptation of an older mythic archetype. The legend's enduring power may lie precisely in this ambiguity. Arthur is simultaneously a man who might have commanded armies, a king who might have ruled a realm, and a symbol who never needed to exist to inspire. The physical traces are faint, but the cultural footprint is enormous, stretching from medieval manuscripts to modern novels, films, and even political rhetoric. And so, we're left with a figure who stands at the crossroads of history and myth, his shadow cast over real battles and imagined quests alike. Was Arthur a flesh-and-blood war leader whose deeds grew in the telling? A fusion of multiple heroes, distilled into a single name for the sake of national identity? Or a purely literary invention, given life by poets and chroniclers who needed a champion for their stories? Whatever the truth, the quest for Arthur continues, in library archives, on windswept hill forts, and in the imaginations of those who can't quite let go of the hope that somewhere, under centuries of legend, there lies a real man whose courage sparked 1,000 years of storytelling. And from Britain's mist-shrouded hills, we turn to a mystery from the ancient world involving a sacred relic whose fate has eluded seekers for millennia. For centuries, the Ark of the Covenant has stood as one of the most enigmatic and sought-after relics in human history. In the biblical tradition, it was the most sacred object of the Israelites. A chest overlaid with gold, with two golden cherubim facing each other, on its lid known as the mercy seat. Inside, according to the Book of Exodus, were the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna. But beyond being a container for holy relics, the Ark was believed to be the physical dwelling place of God's presence on earth, a source of immense spiritual, and perhaps even supernatural, power. Wherever the Ark went, the biblical accounts say, it brought victory, protection, and sometimes even devastation. Its role in the early history of Israel was anything but ceremonial. According to Scripture, the Ark accompanied the Israelites on their journey through the wilderness after the Exodus from Egypt. It led them into battle, was carried across the Jordan River as the waters parted, and was present during the collapse of the walls of Jericho. It rested in the tabernacle during the time of the Judges, and later in the first temple built by King Solomon in Jerusalem. In the biblical narrative, it was the beating heart of Israel's faith, politics, and identity. Then, abruptly, it vanishes from the historical record. The last widely accepted mention of the Ark in the Bible comes in the late 7th century BC, during the reign of King Josiah, a reformist monarch who centralized worship in Jerusalem and sought to eliminate idolatry. Less than half a century later, in 587 BC, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar II besieged and destroyed Jerusalem, razing the first temple to the ground. Precious temple treasures are listed among the spoils taken to Babylon, but the Ark itself is conspicuously absent. From that moment on, history falls silent on its fate. Over the centuries, countless theories have been proposed. One of the most enduring is that the Ark was hidden deliberately before the Babylonians arrived. Some Jewish traditions, recorded in later writings, suggest that it was concealed by priests in a secret chamber beneath the Temple Mount, or spirited away to Mount Nebo, where Moses is said to have viewed the Promised Land. The problem is that the Temple Mount has never been excavated in modern times. Political and religious sensitivities make it one of the most archaeologically inaccessible places on Earth. Whatever might lie beneath its surface remains untouched, and perhaps that's exactly what has preserved this mystery. Another claim, equally persistent, comes from Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains that the Ark was taken there by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and has been kept for centuries in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. Only one guardian monk is allowed to see it, and no outsider is permitted inside. Despite repeated requests from researchers, no independent verification has ever been granted. To believers, the secrecy protects the sanctity of the Ark. To skeptics, it leaves the claim unproven. There are still more far-flung traditions. The Lemba people of southern Africa, a group with oral traditions claiming descent from ancient Israelites, tell of a sacred object called the Ngoma Lungandu, a wooden drum-like chest carried into battle and venerated as a divine relic. Some scholars have suggested that it could be a memory of the Ark or a related object. Medieval Irish legends speak of sacred treasures brought by holy men that bear a suspicious resemblance to biblical descriptions. In the Islamic tradition, the Quran refers to a tabut al-sakina, a chest of tranquility, which, like the Ark, was a source of divine reassurance to its people. If the Ark did survive the Babylonian destruction, how far could it have traveled? Ancient trade routes stretched from the Levant deep into Africa, across Arabia, and into the Mediterranean. The sheer mobility of goods, people, and ideas in the ancient world leaves open the possibility that it could have been transported great distances, or, just as easily, buried in some hidden chamber, only meters from where it once stood. Archaeologists have, at times, come tantalizingly close to areas that could hold clues. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers mapped a network of underground passages and cisterns beneath Jerusalem. Some of these remain sealed or collapsed, their contents unknown. The Temple Mount itself, under the custodianship of the Islamic Waqf, has seen renovations and construction work in which earth and stone have been removed, sometimes revealing ancient architectural fragments, but no ark. The physical description of the ark in biblical texts invites its own speculation. Based on the measurements given in Exodus, roughly 1.1 meters long, 0.67 meters wide, and 0.67 meters high, it would have been a portable chest, albeit heavy with its gold covering. It was carried on poles inserted through rings, never touched directly. Such design elements are consistent with other ancient Near Eastern sacred chests, particularly in Egypt, which suggests the Israelites could have adapted the concept from neighboring cultures. If so, then the Ark was part of a broader tradition of mobile sanctuaries, but its religious significance and the mythology built around it remain unique. There is also the question of why no credible fragment of the Ark has ever emerged in the antiquities market, given the centuries of looting that the Levant has endured. Even the most famous relics, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, surfaced eventually. Could the Ark have been dismantled, its gold reused and its wooden core destroyed, leaving nothing to identify? Or could it have been so well hidden that it truly has remained untouched for over 2,600 years? Some suggest a more symbolic interpretation, that the Ark's disappearance was not the loss of an object, but the end of a phase in Israel's spiritual life. Once the temple was destroyed and the people exiled, the Ark's function as the focal point of worship may have been deliberately closed, its absence becoming a theological statement rather than an accident of history. That doesn't explain the lack of any physical trace, but it underscores how central the Ark's symbolism remained long after it was gone. The fascination with the Ark has only grown in the modern era, amplified by literature, speculative history, and popular culture. Raiders of the Lost Ark may have given it a Hollywood image, but the real intrigue doesn't need embellishment. Here was an artifact that, if found, could be directly linked to one of history's most influential ancient cultures, and perhaps even yield physical evidence from the biblical period itself. What makes the Ark's mystery so enduring is the perfect balance of what we know and what we don't. We have detailed, consistent descriptions from multiple ancient sources, placing it in specific historical contexts. We can trace its movements across decades and tie its story to real geopolitical events. And then, silence. No confirmed sightings, no surviving fragments, no record of its destruction, just competing traditions, each certain they hold the truth, none able to prove it. Whether the Ark lies buried in a sealed chamber beneath Jerusalem, hidden in a church in Ethiopia, remembered in the oral traditions of distant peoples, or lost forever to history, it remains one of the most tantalizing absences in the archaeological record. And until someone can open the right chamber, dig in the right spot, or be granted access to the right guarded door, the Ark of the Covenant will stay where it has been for millennia. Not in our hands, but in the realm of legend, faith, and unanswered questions. The Kensington Runestone is one of those artifacts that sits right on the border between accepted history and something that could completely rewrite the books if proven genuine. It was discovered in 1898 by a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Oman while he was clearing land near the small town of Kensington, Minnesota. According to his account, he found the stone tangled in the roots of a poplar tree. Measuring about 76 centimeters long, 41 centimeters wide, and 15 centimeters thick, it was inscribed with runes, characters from the writing systems used by Norse and other Germanic peoples in the Middle Ages. The inscription itself, once translated, claimed to be from a party of Norse explorers in the year 1362. The text tells of a group of 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians on a journey from Vinland, Norse territory in North America, into the interior. It describes them camping by two rocky islets, only to return from fishing to find 10 of their men red with blood and dead. The survivors reportedly buried their comrades and carved the inscription as a record before continuing. If taken at face value, the runestone would suggest that Norse explorers traveled not just to Newfoundland, as confirmed by the site at L'Anse aux Meadows, but all the way into what is now Minnesota, well over 1,000 miles inland. The route, as speculated by supporters of the stone's authenticity, might have involved traveling through Hudson Bay, into the Nelson and Red Rivers, and then portaging into the Great Lakes system before moving up rivers into the upper Midwest. It's an epic journey to imagine. Canoes laden with gear, groups of explorers pushing deep into unfamiliar and challenging landscapes. But the stone's discovery almost immediately sparked controversy. Within a few years of its unveiling, Scandinavian linguists began raising doubts. They claimed that some of the rune forms and grammar didn't match what would have been used in the 14th century. Some were more in line with 19th century Swedish, a suspicious detail given that Oman himself was a Swedish immigrant. Critics suggested it was an elaborate hoax, perhaps created by Scandinavian settlers for reasons ranging from practical jokes to cultural pride. However, others pointed out that the Norse language and runes in 14th century Greenland, the likely point of origin for such an expedition, could have evolved differently from those in mainland Scandinavia. Supporters argued that many of the modern forms on the stone could have been perfectly normal in a Greenlandic context, especially if the explorers had been isolated from European language changes for centuries. This idea gained more traction when researchers uncovered medieval documents with similar rune variants. Adding to the intrigue is the question of weathering. Geologists have examined the Kensington Runestone to determine how long the carved surfaces had been exposed. Early studies in the 1910s claimed the runes looked too sharp and unworn to be medieval. But in the 2000s, new geological analyses suggested that the weathering patterns were consistent with centuries of exposure, though determining an exact date is notoriously tricky. If the runestone is genuine, it would force a massive rethinking of Norse exploration. We already know they reached Newfoundland by around 1000 AD, but this would place them in the heart of North America more than 300 years later, interacting, possibly violently, with indigenous peoples. It would also raise fascinating questions. What was the purpose of the expedition? Were they searching for resources, establishing trade routes, or perhaps scouting for settlement sites? The text itself gives no hint beyond the tragedy that befell part of the group. And here lies one of the eeriest details. There is no trace, archaeological or otherwise, of where the 10 red with blood and dead were buried. No graves matching such a description have been found in the region. If this was a real massacre, the burial site could still lie undiscovered somewhere in the Minnesota wilderness, an unmarked connection between the Old World and the New. The lack of any other matching historical records is also a stumbling block. The Greenland Norse kept some records, as did the Icelandic sagas, but there's no known text that lines up neatly with the Kensington Runestone story. If it is authentic, it might represent an isolated venture that left no lasting mark on Norse society, one more small, forgotten episode in the long, slow withdrawal of Norse culture from the Western Atlantic. Over the decades, the stone has drawn attention from scholars, adventurers, and fringe theorists alike. It's been called everything from a priceless relic to an elaborate fraud. It has been exhibited, examined, and re-examined. Today, it resides in the Runestone Museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, still at the center of a debate that refuses to die. Even now, modern scanning and imaging technology continues to be applied in hopes of finding a definitive answer. Laser scans of the inscriptions have revealed micro-chisel marks and details invisible to the naked eye. Some experts argue these support the case for authenticity. Others see them as consistent with more modern carving tools. The same evidence seems to confirm two opposing interpretations, proof that in archaeology, context is everything. And that's what keeps the Kensington Runestone so captivating. It's a physical object you can see and touch, with a story carved into its surface. It sits squarely in a landscape where Norse exploration is not entirely implausible, yet every detail is just slippery enough to prevent a clear answer. The possibility that it's genuine is tantalizing because of what it would mean: an unrecorded Norse push deep into North America, centuries before Columbus. The possibility that it's a hoax is equally intriguing, because if it is, it's an extraordinarily clever one, sophisticated enough to keep experts divided for over a century. So, is the Kensington Runestone a medieval message left by exhausted survivors of a doomed expedition, or the product of a 19th century imagination? Until new evidence emerges, be it another inscription, a buried campsite, or a matching record in some forgotten archive, it will remain what it has been since the day it was unearthed, an unyielding stone with a story that might change history, if only we could prove it. When Alexander the Great crossed from Europe into Asia Minor in the spring of 334 BC, he was still a young king at the head of a relatively small army. Yet his campaign would become one of the most famous in history. His first major test came at the Granicus River, where Persian satraps and their forces gathered to stop him. The battle, fought on the steep banks of a fast-flowing river, was a brutal clash of cavalry charges, desperate infantry engagements, and high personal risk. Alexander himself was nearly killed in the fighting. But in the end, the Macedonian-led army routed the Persian forces, opening the door to the rest of Asia Minor. Ancient historians like Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus record the battle's heroics in detail: names of generals, tactical maneuvers, the near-fatal blow Alexander took to the head. Yet, buried in the aftermath of this victory is a lesser-known mystery. At some point after the battle, a number of Alexander's men vanish from the historical record. They weren't simply cut down in combat. They're absent from lists of later campaigns, never mentioned among those who fought in subsequent victories. It's as if, following the triumph at Granicus, they took a different path entirely. Some ancient sources hint at the possibility that Alexander left garrisons behind in newly secured cities, blending his soldiers with the local populations. This was part of a larger strategy. Rather than simply loot and leave, Alexander often attempted to integrate his conquests, founding settlements or renaming existing ones, leaving behind Macedonian or Greek soldiers who could serve as both administrators and a stabilizing military presence. The early stages of his campaign were particularly rich in opportunities for this. Towns across Asia Minor, some Greek in culture, others thoroughly Persian, suddenly found themselves under Macedonian rule. The men who disappeared from the army rolls after Granicus may have been stationed in such places, tasked with securing Alexander's new territories. But the trail goes cold here. We have no complete rosters, no stone inscriptions listing the names of these garrison soldiers. If they stayed behind, they essentially melted into local life, perhaps marrying into the community, taking up trade, or rising to positions of influence in mixed Greek local administrations. The more romantic theory, and one that's fueled legends for centuries, is that some of these men wandered far from Asia Minor, either on Alexander's orders or on their own initiative. As the campaign pushed east into Central Asia, Alexander's army encountered a bewildering array of peoples and cultures. Later accounts from Roman times speak of Greek-speaking tribes living in remote parts of modern-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even further into Central Asia. Could these be the descendants of soldiers who, after Granicus or another early battle, chose to stay behind in newly conquered territories far from home? The connection becomes even more intriguing when we consider that Alexander founded over 20 cities during his campaigns, many of which bore his name. While some were purely military outposts, others became thriving, multi-ethnic communities where Greek, Persian, and local traditions mixed. In places like Ai-Khanum in modern Afghanistan, archaeological evidence shows Greek-style temples, theaters, and inscriptions centuries after Alexander's time. If a detachment of his men found themselves in a fertile region with strategic value, it's easy to imagine them planting roots and establishing a permanent Hellenic presence there. Of course, the simplest explanation is attrition. Campaigns of this scale were grueling. Men could be reassigned, lost to disease, wounded and sent home, or simply perish in small, unrecorded skirmishes. The ancient historians were selective in what they reported, and administrative records from the time are fragmentary at best. Still, the abrupt vanishing of certain troop numbers after such a significant battle stands out enough to invite speculation. And that speculation is helped along by some tantalizing later reports. During the centuries following Alexander's campaigns, travelers and historians occasionally noted the presence of communities that spoke a Greek dialect and preserved certain Greek customs, despite being surrounded by entirely different cultures. The Romans encountered such people in Central Asia and wrote about them with curiosity. These enclaves might have been the remnants of Alexander's garrisons, still distinct generations later. One of the most famous examples is the Kalash people of northern Pakistan. Though their language today is not Greek, their distinct traditions, lighter features in some cases, and certain cultural practices have led to popular theories linking them to Alexander's soldiers. Linguists and anthropologists have largely moved away from the idea of a direct, unbroken connection, but the theory still persists in local lore and popular imagination. It speaks to the enduring allure of Alexander's story that his men could have left behind living traces in some of the most remote corners of Asia. There's also the matter of how Alexander himself approached the integration of his army with conquered peoples. He was known for encouraging his soldiers to take local wives and adopt certain elements of local dress and custom. This was controversial among his Macedonian and Greek officers, but it served his vision of a blended empire. If some of the men who vanished after Granicus were early adopters of this policy, they might have been absorbed into local society so thoroughly that they ceased to be identifiable as Macedonian soldiers. Archaeology offers only scattered clues. Excavations in former satrapal capitals and along known campaign routes have uncovered Greek-style pottery, inscriptions, and weaponry dating to the period immediately after Alexander's passage. In some cases, these finds are far from where the main army is believed to have traveled, suggesting smaller, detached groups moving independently. Could these have been remnants of those early detachments, carrying their culture deep into the hinterlands? The mystery is deepened by the way ancient sources sometimes contradict each other. Arrian might list a set number of forces engaged at one battle, while Curtius Rufus gives a slightly different figure. When these are compared across the timeline of the campaign, discrepancies emerge, numbers that never quite reconcile. Historians often chalk this up to the imprecision of ancient record-keeping, but it also leaves just enough space for theories about missing contingents. What makes this story linger is the image it conjures. Somewhere, far from the main sweep of Alexander's conquests, a group of Greek and Macedonian soldiers settling down, adapting, and becoming part of a new land. Perhaps they passed down stories of the young king they had followed across the river at Granicus, of the first great clash in Asia, of the day their world expanded beyond anything they had known. Or perhaps, within a generation, their origins became just another thread in the rich tapestry of cultures along the ancient trade routes. Whether they assimilated, migrated further east, or perished in obscurity, the disappearance of these men remains one of the small but compelling mysteries woven into the grand narrative of Alexander's conquests. It's a reminder that even in the most well-documented historical campaigns, there are gaps, human stories that slip through the cracks, leaving us to wonder just how far their journeys really went, and whether some trace of them still survives, hidden in plain sight. From the rugged campaigns of Alexander's army, we move to the quiet hills of southern Ohio, where an ancient earthwork stretches across the landscape in the shape of a massive coiled serpent, its open mouth seemingly poised to swallow a perfectly shaped oval. The Great Serpent Mound, at 1,348 feet in length, is the largest surviving effigy mound in the world, and for over a century, it has puzzled archaeologists, historians, and astronomers alike. From the ground, the scale is difficult to appreciate. The serpent's sinuous body rises only a few feet above the surrounding terrain, yet from above, its outline is strikingly clear. The coils twist and curve in a deliberate pattern, and the head, or perhaps open jaws, frames an egg-shaped embankment that some believe represents the sun, the moon, or even a cosmic egg from Native American creation stories. Its sheer size means that whoever designed it had an understanding of large-scale planning, surveying, and coordination across many laborers. Dating the mound has proven to be one of its enduring mysteries. Early scholars attributed it to the Adena culture, active in the region between roughly 1000 and 200 BC, largely because of Adena burial mounds nearby. Later, radiocarbon testing of charcoal found within parts of the earthwork suggested a construction date closer to 1070 CE, which would make it the work of the Fort Ancient culture. The Hopewell, who thrived in the area between the Adena and Fort Ancient periods, have also been suggested as possible builders. Without definitive archaeological evidence linking it to a single culture, the debate continues, and with it, questions about why the mound was built in the first place. One of the most captivating aspects of the Serpent Mound is its possible astronomical alignment. Researchers have noted that the head aligns with the setting sun on the summer solstice, while other points along the coils correspond to sunrise or sunset at the solstices and equinoxes, as well as certain lunar events. If intentional, this would imply a sophisticated understanding of astronomy by its builders, enabling them to use the mound as a kind of massive calendar, perhaps for agricultural cycles, ceremonial timing, or both. Yet skeptics caution that alignments can occur by coincidence, and that without clear cultural records, it's hard to know if these were deliberate or a byproduct of the mound's serpentine shape. The serpent motif itself carries deep resonance in many Native American traditions. Serpents often appear in myths as symbols of fertility, renewal, or transformation. In some stories, they guard the underworld or serve as messengers between realms. In the Ohio region, effigy mounds shaped like animals, including birds, bears, and panthers, are known, but none match the scale and elegance of the Serpent Mound. The egg-shaped feature in its jaws adds another layer of interpretation, potentially linking it to cosmological beliefs about creation or the balance between life and death. Yet for all its possible symbolism, practical questions remain. Building such a structure without metal tools, machinery, or advanced surveying instruments would have required a massive coordinated effort. Soil would have been carried in baskets, the curves measured and adjusted by eye or with simple tools, the shape maintained over generations despite erosion. That suggests not only planning, but also a community invested enough in the project to sustain it through completion, and possibly to maintain it afterward. Then there's the puzzle of the surrounding landscape. The mound sits atop a plateau within a geological feature known as the Serpent Mound Crater, formed by a meteor impact hundreds of millions of years ago. Some researchers have speculated that this unusual setting may have had special significance to the builders, whether for its commanding views, distinctive soil, or spiritual associations. Others note that from the mound's location, you can see for miles, a potential advantage if the site also served as a gathering place or ceremonial center. Adding to the mystery are questions of preservation. Unlike many earthworks that have been flattened by agriculture or development, the Serpent Mound has remained remarkably intact. By the time European settlers arrived in the region, it was still a prominent feature, and in the late 19th century, it became one of the first archaeological sites to be preserved by a private historical society. This act of preservation likely saved it from being plowed over, but it also means that some of the archaeological context, artifacts, soil layers, or organic material, was disturbed during early restoration efforts. That complicates modern attempts to determine its exact age and purpose. Despite decades of study, no definitive artifacts have been found within the mound itself to pinpoint its creators or function. The lack of associated burials, which are common in other Adena and Hopewell mounds, rules out its use as a traditional tomb. The absence of everyday artifacts suggests it wasn't a habitation site. This leaves scholars to lean heavily on the form, location, and alignments to build their theories, a process that inevitably leaves room for interpretation, and sometimes for speculation that strays into the fantastical. For example, some alternative researchers have proposed that the Serpent Mound marks a celestial event, perhaps a comet strike or a rare astronomical alignment, and was intended as a warning to future generations. Others see it as part of a network of ancient sites across North America, connected by ley lines or shared ceremonial practices, implying a level of cultural connection far greater than mainstream archaeology accepts. While these ideas lack solid evidence, they speak to the mound's power to inspire wonder and the sense that it may hold messages we have yet to decode. The mound's enduring allure lies in the convergence of these factors: its imposing size, precise curves, possible astronomical connections, and the absence of a clear builder or purpose. Standing on the ridge and looking along the serpent's undulating body, you can't help but feel the weight of time, and the presence of people whose worldview and priorities were very different from our own, yet sophisticated in ways we still struggle to grasp. Was the Great Serpent Mound a calendar, a monument to myth, a gathering place for ceremonies, or a combination of all three? Or does it mark something entirely outside our current frame of reference? Whatever the answer, the serpent continues to wind silently across the Ohio landscape, a reminder that some mysteries resist tidy conclusions. And it's that very resistance that keeps us coming back, measuring its curves, watching the solstice sun dip toward the horizon, and wondering what its builders saw when they stood here 1,000 years ago. From the ancient coils of the Serpent Mound, we climb into a far more modern mystery, one set on the most dangerous stage in mountaineering history, the upper slopes of Mount Everest in 1924. This is where two British climbers, George Mallory and Andrew "Sandy" Irvine, stepped into the thin, icy air and vanished, leaving behind one of the greatest unanswered questions in exploration. Did they reach the summit nearly 3 decades before Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay's confirmed ascent in 1953? By the early 1920s, Everest had already claimed a mythical place in the public imagination. The British Empire, still reeling from the losses of World War I, saw Everest as both a symbol and a challenge, the ultimate mountain to be conquered. George Mallory, a schoolteacher turned climber with movie star looks and a poet's turn of phrase, became the public face of the effort. When asked why he wanted to climb Everest, his reply, "Because it's there," became the most famous 3 words in mountaineering. The 1924 expedition was not Britain's first attempt. Previous efforts in 1921 and 1922 had mapped routes and pushed high on the mountain, but storms, thin air, and sheer exhaustion had forced climbers back. For the third attempt, Mallory and Irvine would take the ambitious route via the North Col, climbing without supplemental oxygen for much of the ascent, a decision that remains controversial today. Irvine, just 22 years old, was chosen less for climbing experience than for his skill with equipment, particularly the primitive oxygen sets. On June 8, 1924, Mallory and Irvine were last seen by teammate Noel Odell, a geologist who had lagged behind. Through a break in the clouds, Odell glimpsed 2 tiny figures, moving deliberately on a high ridge, nearing what he believed was the second step, just below the summit. Moments later, the weather closed in, and the mountain swallowed them whole. Whether they had already reached the top, were about to, or still had a long climb ahead, is the crux of the mystery. In the years that followed, speculation became legend. If they had summited, it would rewrite the history of mountaineering, crediting the first ascent not to Hillary and Norgay in 1953, but to 2 men climbing with wool clothing, hobnail boots, and rudimentary gear nearly 3 decades earlier. But no proof emerged. Search expeditions in the 1930s turned up a few discarded oxygen bottles and scraps of canvas, but nothing to answer the ultimate question. That changed in 1999 when an American-led team discovered Mallory's body at 26,760 feet. Perfectly preserved by the cold, he lay face down, his torso twisted, arms outstretched as though trying to arrest a fall. His injuries suggested a fall from high up, possibly while roped to Irvine. Yet the find raised as many questions as it answered. In his pockets were letters, a watch, and climbing notes. But missing was a small photograph of his wife Ruth that Mallory had promised to leave on the summit. Did he lose it in the wind, or did he place it there as planned? The greatest potential clue was also missing: Irvine's body and the small Kodak vest pocket camera he was carrying. If recovered and the film miraculously preserved, it could show once and for all whether the pair had stood atop Everest. Rumors persist that Irvine's body has been sighted high on the mountain, possibly by Chinese climbers in the 1960s, but no confirmed recovery has been made. Modern climbers and historians debate the odds. Supporters of the "they did it" camp point to Mallory's experience, their rapid pace on summit day, and the fact that the second step, a near-vertical rock wall, could theoretically have been climbed without modern aids, albeit with extreme difficulty. Skeptics counter that the technical challenges, combined with dwindling daylight and oxygen, make it unlikely they reached the top and still had time to descend. Over the years, tantalizing fragments have emerged. In 1933, an ice axe was found at roughly 27,760 feet, now believed to have belonged to Irvine. In 2001, climbers found an oxygen bottle far higher than previously thought, suggesting the men had made remarkable progress before vanishing. Theories range from a fatal fall during the descent, to collapse from exhaustion, to being trapped in worsening weather and succumbing in the dark. The story endures because it blends adventure, tragedy, and the allure of an answer that always seems just out of reach. Everest has claimed over 300 lives since Mallory and Irvine disappeared, yet few capture the imagination like these two. Every new expedition that scours the mountain's high slopes carries the hope of finding Irvine and his camera, and with it, the truth. And so, the question remains: were Mallory and Irvine the first to stand on the roof of the world? Or did they come agonizingly close, only to fall short, leaving their dream and the proof frozen somewhere high on Everest? Until the mountain yields its secrets, the mystery will continue to cling to those icy ridges, whispering to each new climber who dares to follow in their footsteps. Over the course of this journey, we've stepped through ancient battlefields, stood in the shadow of colossal monuments, examined enigmatic artifacts, and traced the faint footprints of people and events that history never fully explained. From long-vanished cultures and unexplained disappearances, to lost treasures and maps that shouldn't exist, each mystery we've explored is grounded in real, tangible evidence, yet each still guards its secrets. Now it's your turn to join the conversation. Which of these mysteries caught your imagination the most? Share your thoughts, your favorite theories, or even your own local mysteries in the comments. Because the more perspectives, the better the hunt for answers. And if you've enjoyed this dive into history's unanswered questions, there's plenty more to come. We'll be back with more strange, well-documented puzzles from the past, each as intriguing and as real as the ones you've heard today. As always, until next time, stay curious.